This story starts with the introduction of Necropia, the realm of the dead, a place completely devoid of a single trace of life. In this desolate world stands a grand castle, the only one in Necropia. This castle is packed with things that are beyond imagination, which includes endless golden pillars, stunning ornaments, and murals. The sprawling marble halls are lined with intricately crafted, glorious sculptures. But the ruler of this place, and at the heart of it all, is the Death King Karnak. Karnak is the supreme ruler of Necropia, having mastered and controlled death itself. But after centuries, he realized that humans weren't meant to wield such power. His huge mistake in messing with death has led to his own regret, as he now finds himself as one of the undead. Before we get deeper into the story, here's the lowdown on how Karnak ended up as an undead. Back in his human days, Karnak was the bastard child of a fallen noble family. He lost his mother when he was young and was constantly pressured by other nobles. Over time, he grew to trust only himself, and the desire for power got stuck in his head. That's when he stumbled upon a forbidden codex about necromancy and veered off the path of being human. Not long after, Karnak drove every human in kingdom to death. The fourth martial king and the 3 grand mages tried to resist, but he turned them into his own subjects. Even the guardians of the world tried to stop him. But when he turned the last remaining guardian, Dragon Emperor Griteria, into his subject, it was game over for everyone. Karnak then transformed his own flesh into the ultimate ascendant of Astra Schnapf, and he finally became the most powerful undead, and the strongest Death King to ever exist. At the time, Karnak thought he'd hit the peak of his life. With absolute power, he believed he'd be able to savor all the pleasures life had to offer. But he was dead wrong. Now 70 years later, he's stuck in a fleshless body with rattling bones. He's not sure how much longer he can endure this pathetic existence, unable to feel or desire any human pleasures. He misses the warm sunshine, the gentle breeze, the warmth of another human, and even the terrible pain that used to dig into his flesh. Anything would be better than this dry, empty life. But it seems he has one last hope of turning back into a human. If he succeeds, his wish might finally be fulfilled. Just then, someone strolls into his castle. With each step, the rattling noise of their armor fills the air. The armored figure calls out to the ruler of life and death, respectfully greeting King Death Karnak. This knight in armor is Barros, the head commander of the Legions of Death. At that moment, the king tells Barros that the preparations are ready, and he's feeling really positive about this. Hearing this, Barros gets all cute and emotional, because he's been searching for a way to recover the pleasures of the flesh alongside Karnak. But they both know that pleasures work by fulfilling what one lacks, and for someone like Karnak and Barros, who have ascended to the ultimate level, no ordinary method could satisfy those needs. However, because they are the ultimate ascended, there's a chance they could find a way to recover their pleasures. They can't enjoy human pleasures because they aren't human anymore, but there might be a way to turn back time to when they were. Karnak then says they'll probably have to go back to the moment he first gained the mana of darkness. Barros is still worried though, and reminds his king that if they fail, their existence might disappear. But Karnak brushes it off, saying that he has no interest in staying stuck as a pile of bones, and further makes it clear that Barros can stay behind if he wants, but he would rather take the risk. While blushing, the armored knight quickly responds that he would never dare to leave his master's side. With that in mind, they both start the mojo. Purple light begins to flash, and after a while, a man's voice can be heard telling his friend to wake up. It looks like whatever mojo they did was a success. Barros has transformed into a blonde dude, while Karnak is on the ground. As Karnak starts to stand up, he's surprised to see Barros in his new look. The blondie then also comments on how Karnak's face has returned to its old, scrawny, pompous appearance. Karnak feels annoyed, and reminds him that he still has no sense of respect. Anyway, they both get up and start looking around. If they've traveled back to the right time, the forbidden codex on necromancy should be nearby. And just as expected, Karnak spots it sitting on a desk. He stares at the codex, reflecting on how he once walked the path of necromancy using knowledge from this very book. Deciding to try out his old powers, he flicks his finger, and a purple fire surrounds the book. Within a few seconds, the book has been turned into nothing but ashes. Barros asks if it's really a good idea to just burn the book like that. But Karnak casually replies that he's already learned everything from it, so it's better if this thing doesn't exist in the world anymore. The knight can't help but admire his king for how he's already planned everything out so carefully. He even comments that Karnak looks more handsome than usual. Suddenly, both of their bellies start to grumble. But instead of feeling sad or dejected, they're absolutely amazed upon hearing this unsettling noise in their belly, because they haven't craved food in ages. They happily and excitedly venture out to grab some grub. A while later, the entire town is echoing with their screams of delight. It's been so long since these two idiots have had a piece of bread, and even this dry bread tastes so amazing that they're calling it nothing short of a masterpiece. Barros is practically tearing up with every bite, barely able to contain the rush of happiness flooding his brain. He's willing to die for food like this. Karnak's reaction is just as intense. Tears are streaming down his face like a waterfall. He reminds Barros, through his own tearful sobs, that they've just been revived. So let's not talk about dying. Barros points out that gambling their lives for this much deliciousness was absolutely worth it. The bread tastes so amazing that it's literally blocking his vision with tears. Karnak agrees but warns Barros to keep an eye on how much he eats. After all, money doesn't just fall from the sky. As they're enjoying their bread, their eyes wander to the table next to them. Delicious smells waft their way, which completely boggles their minds. I mean, who wouldn't lose their mind seeing a whole roasted chicken, perfectly golden and mouth-watering? As much as they want to devour it, there's no way they can afford it. It's going to cost a fortune, and Karnak is from a fallen noble family. The desire to eat that chicken is so intense that this idiot is even considering killing these bastards, while Barros is freaking out in the background, warning his friend that they're going to get beaten up with their current strength. Barros decides to check his pouch to see how much money they have since they need to pay for the bread too. But when he looks inside, despair washes over his face. He quickly calls out to Karnak, saying they have a little problem. Karnak asks what's wrong, and Barros reveals that their time travel had some unexpected effects on other things too. Karnak also looks into his pouch and finds it strange. There's no way they should have this much money, and most of it is in silver coins. He wonders where things began to go wrong. You see, in his past life, his family's financial situation was dire. His grandfather, Baron Greyfield, had started numerous businesses using the territory as collateral, but they all failed, leaving only debts behind for his father, Baron Kraput. Unfortunately, his father couldn't handle the mounting debts, and his original wife and 2 sons were no help at all. Karnak, the bastard child born into the fallen family, received all of the family's scorn and persecution, barely managing to survive each day. At least, that's how it played out in his past life, so he has no clue where all this money could have come from. He is genuinely worried about this. It's not something to take lightly, and he wonders if the regression spell might have gone wrong. But Barros admits he's not sure either. Karnak is not sure if they have actually time-traveled into the past, or they have just hopped into an entirely different timeline. But he pushes those worries aside when Barros reminds him that they can finally enjoy that delicious chicken. After all, their concerns won't just disappear if they don't use the money. Karnak quickly gives Barros the green light to place an order. Barros decides to get 1 chicken, but Karnak insists they should each have their own, so they end up ordering 2 whole chickens for themselves. As dusk settles, Barros's belly is stuffed to the brim, his shirt barely containing the bulge as his stomach tries to escape. His master is also feeling totally satisfied, and he is sure they should be able to pass out and sleep once they get back. Barros then grumbles about having to see their old family again. He's genuinely pissed off, as he hated them with every fiber of his being. Karnak reassures Barros that they'll be fine as long as they play their cards right and flatter the old family. But he admits their main concern is how everything has changed. Even the horses are different compared to what they had in their previous life. Not to mention the stable manager who seemed to be overly friendly and treating them like royalty. It's odd that a fallen family would have such a high-quality horse. Moreover, the citizens they bumped into earlier were acting completely out of character. Those who once scorned them and called them scoundrels were now thrilled to see them and even teared up with joy. Karnak agrees, saying there's definitely something strange going on. He just can't shake off the weirdness of it all. Barros tells him that they'll figure it out once they return home, and it looks like they have almost made it to the place. Karnak comments on how he hasn't seen the place in a while and is feeling strangely nostalgic about it. Barros, on the other hand, is just plain annoyed, because he doesn't have a single good memory of this place. You see, Barros was also an orphan and didn't live a comfortable life. His parents were absolute scumbags. Before they disappeared in the middle of the night, Barros was the one who found himself alone and dying. A surprising twist came when Karnak's father took him in, despite the family's disdain for illegitimate children. As a result, Barros ended up with an attendant position, which, despite the circumstances, gave him some much-needed stability in his life. Suddenly, Barros points in a certain direction and asks Karnak if that's the Gestar residence. Once Karnak looks in the direction Barros pointed, he quickly confirms it, saying this is the place they used to live in. The mansion behind the walls is massive, and Barros can't help but comment that they might have stumbled upon the wrong place. But Karnak quickly points out that this is definitely the place from his memories. He sees the tall brick wall, the 2-story building with a terrace, and the extensive garden surrounding it. It all looks familiar, but it seems surprisingly lavish, and he has no clue from where they got all this money to spend. When they reach the door, the gatekeeper perks up and greets Karnak promptly. Not only are they welcomed, but the staff bows their heads in respect, leaving both of them astounded. Inside the mansion, the butler, who goes by the name Fapel Plaid, starts serving them tea and explains that it's been almost half a year since Karnak became the head of the family. This shocks Karnak, while the butler then asks if Karnak has achieved the goal he was aiming for. Of course, Karnak has no clue what goal the butler is talking about. Seeing Karnak's cluelessness, the butler asks if he's forgotten the reason he went on his journey. Karnak pretends to remember and says he sort of found his goal. The butler perks up at this, and mentions that the late Lord and Isabella would have been glad to hear this. As soon as Karnak and Barros hear the word late, Karnak quickly realizes that his father is dead, and it seems his stepmother must have died with him. The butler then points out that after Tessil and Ferelth passed away as well, times were grim, but he's glad to see Karnak around handling everything. This explains why Karnak became the Lord in the first place, but he still has no clue why his entire family died. The goal of his journey is obvious to him, and he's sure he must have been practicing necromancy while no one was watching. Barros leans in closer and reminds Karnak that there's no way he could have revealed the true goal of their journey. Karnak agrees, saying that's why he must have spouted some nonsense about going on a journey, though he is not sure why he would need necromancy in a situation like this. The butler notices their concern and asks why they're worrying so much. Barros quickly explains that the young master is exhausted from the long journey and suggests continuing the conversation tomorrow. The butler panics a bit and apologizes, saying he completely failed to consider that, and quickly escorts Karnak to his room for some well-deserved rest. Once inside, Karnak and Barros give each other a high five for cleverly getting into the room. Blondie then points out that, although they've managed to avoid trouble for now, they're still in the dark about what to do next. Everything is so new that he has no idea what's going on. Karnak then says he has a method for times like this and asks his friend if he's ready. He tells Barros they need to hurry because they have to make their move while everyone is asleep. As midnight strikes, we see the old butler sleeping soundly in his room. That's when Karnak and Barros sneak in. Blondie hands over his friend a bowl of herbs, and they decide to continue the mind inspection now. Karnak pours a purple substance into the bowl, and the medicine quickly starts to seep into the butler's brain through his nose. As soon as Karnak calls the butler to wake up, the old man's body starts to stir, and he quickly responds to his master. Karnak begins by asking him to explain the whole process of how the gestured finances improved and how he became the head of the household. The old man starts narrating that 4 years ago, while the second Yukon master was training, he happened to come across a large-scale copper mine. Karnak's eyebrows raise at this. To him, it sounds like a bunch of bullcrap because, as far as he knows, the mines were just an excuse used to hide dirty money. Even Barros nods in agreement, saying it's actually quite rare to stumble upon a mine like that. Karnak then asks why everyone in the family died within just 4 years if that's the case. The old man explains that the whole mess started with the location of the copper mine, because it was in a neutral zone between the Gestured and Deventor families. Both sides claimed it was theirs, which kicked off a war. The Deventors, who were known for their top-notch military training, had no trouble taking down Baron Craput. Sir Randolph from the Deventor family easily defeated him, and also killed young Master Tessil and the oldest son. The household's best knight, second young Master Ferelth, lost both his legs to Sir Randolph and ended up taking his own life. The Baroness, heartbroken by all the losses, didn't last long after that. So, young Master Karnak was picked to take over, even though he was just a kid. The families agreed to a ceasefire until he was old enough to take charge. But everyone was still worried about the copper mine and what would happen with the war compensation. That's when young Master Karnak came up with a plan, and he challenged Viscount Deventor to a trial duel, all in the name of Allium, the goddess of moon and justice. When the two idiots hear this, their jaws practically drop. You see, trial duels are held under the Allium Order's mandates, where you can even substitute a warrior in your place. The duel happens under the watchful eyes of an Allium priest, and the victor is decided only when one side dies. Barros leans in and tells his friend that it looks like he's really dug his own grave. Our boy just facepalms in frustration, admitting that this wasn't exactly his idea. He figures that's why everyone is treating him so nicely, because he's probably going to lose this fight. But it kinda makes sense why his past self would agree to duel, because he knows that he can't win the war, and Deventor couldn't refuse the duel without damaging their reputation. By now, the only way to get out of this mess is to win the duel and secure the copper mine, and this is the only way to save them from starving. Barros points out, though, that with Karnak's current skills, he's pretty much a goner. Karnak, however, is determined to win this fight at all costs, and declares that this is exactly why he needs to train as hard as possible. He asks the old man when the duel is scheduled, and the butler informs him it's about a month away. Of course, both of them look utterly clueless and hopeless, because the duel is just around the corner with barely any time left to practice. Later, the table is piled high with mouth-watering food. Our guy reminds his friend that he's arranged all of this for his friend, because he's always working so hard and deserves a treat. But Barros questions if this is really the best time to relax, with the duel so close. Karnak just shrugs it off and cheerfully asks Barros if he could attend the duel instead. Of course, Barros's chewing comes to a halt as he realizes that the fancy food was just a bit of bribery. He quickly apologizes, admitting he's not exactly thrilled about the prospect of dying. Karnak reminds him that he's taken down 3 of the 4 martial kings single-handedly, so why he is feeling afraid of a simple duel. Barros explains in response that this was all thanks to the necromancy magic, and you can't just rely on experience to gain martial prowess. He gives an analogy, saying it's pointless to learn advanced swordsmanship if you don't have the arms to wield a sword. He admits he might have pulled it off with 6 months of training, but a month just isn't enough. Once he hears this, our guy quickly snatches the food away from Barros and tells him not to touch any more of it. Barros then asks why he didn't choose someone from the Knight Order. Our guy reminds him that if anyone from the Order had been strong enough, they wouldn't be having this conversation. Fired up, he declares that he's ready to use necromancy if that's what it takes to win the battle. But then Karnak remembers there's a hitch in this plan: necromancy is banned. He recalls that back in the day, when they were on the run, they had to eliminate a household stealthily using necromancy. The priest of Allium accused him of being the necromancer, and it was clear the priests were certain it was the work of dark magic. So once he was surrounded by enemies, he had to unleash his necromancy powers to escape. While he was running, he asked his junior how those people knew he used necromancy, even though the Necromancy Codex clearly said no one can detect this magic. That's when Barros explains that it's only civilian mages and knights who wouldn't be able to detect it, and someone like priests are an exception. Our guy lets out a sigh and laments how their plan is now a total flop. They can't use necromancy in the presence of the priests during the duel. Just then, Barros comes up with a brilliant idea. Why not just grab some money and run away? But Karnak dismisses this, saying it would be a waste of an opportunity. All the family members he despised are dead, and the people who disliked him once now like him very much. Suddenly, as Barros is heading down with the food, his senior stops him and tells him to sit back down because another shady plan has popped into his head. He admits it might be somewhat dangerous. But before we can hear more about this new plan, the scene transitions to the northern fort of Deventor. Soldiers are in the thick of combat, and when the senior officer orders a break, everyone collapses from exhaustion. The only one still standing in the field is Randolph, Deventor's strongest knight. A scrawny figure, known as Sir Bright, approaches him and asks how preparations for the trial duel are going. Randolph explains to Sir Bright that he doesn't need to prepare much for someone as unskilled as their opponent. Sir Bright agrees but advises him not to let his guard down. But the knight laughs it off once again, and finds it ridiculous that he has to waste his time on a spoiled young master who knows nothing about the real world. But still, Sir Bright is concerned. Even though he's confident that Sir Randolph would never lose, he suspects the Karnak must have some kind of plan if he requested this duel. Suddenly they hear a commotion nearby. Sir Bright turns to see a merchant selling goods at the front of the yard, and he's annoyed by the constant presence of these outsiders peddling their wares. And of course, this merchant is none other than our boy, rocking a fake mustache while keeping a close eye on enemy activity. After watching Randolph fight, he realizes that while Randolph might be particularly powerful in combat, his opponent actually has a chance of winning in a one-on-one battle. Randolph is the simple, foolish type who relies on typical heavy sword techniques and hasn't even learned battle aura yet. It's easy to predict the movements of opponents like Randolph, which is a good thing for our boy. However, he's still certain that he needs more than a month to compete with this guy effectively. As he sits there, a woman calls out to him, asking why he's watching her brother Randolph so closely, like a total creep. Our boy quickly stands up and asks if she's really Randolph's little sister. She confirms she is, and asks if he has any business with Randolph. He explains that he's been captivated by the prowess of the North's strongest knight. To divert her attention, he points to his stall, showcasing a variety of colorful handkerchiefs and other stuff. Predictably, being the woman she is, she falls for the bait and expresses interest in one of the handkerchiefs. Our boy is pleased to see that he's managed to distract her just as he intended. The next scene transitions to the Jestar Estate's personal drill hall, where Barros is once again present. He explains that he's returned and asks our boy if his stamina training is going well. But, well, things aren't going as well as they hoped. Our guy is sprawled out on the ground, looking like his soul has already left his body. Blondie frantically shakes his master, telling him to wake up, and our boy groans, telling him to stop shaking him, or he might throw up all the delicious food he just ate. Blondie then asks if he ran the 50 laps around the drill hall like he was told. Karnak explains that he just finished and collapsed because he can't run anymore. Blondie remarks that his stamina is seriously lacking and that he's got a long way to go. Karnak then asks if there's even a point to all this training. To which Blondie replies that he can't do much with his current scrawny body, so he's got to keep grinding to at least build some muscle. But Karnak just can't endure this torture any longer and pleads with his friend to let him rest for a moment. Blondie puts on a creepy expression as he reminds his senior that the real training hasn't even started yet and he's not joking around. The poor guy asks if the exercises he's done so far weren't the real deal. Blondie casually explains that what he did was merely rehab, and the actual training is only about to begin. As Blondie says this, he looks absolutely devilish in the eyes of our poor lad, who just wants to kick back and relax after finally regaining his human body. The next day, the first thing they did was to make sure to eat plenty of protein-rich food, and after that, they headed to the drill hall and started with 100 push-ups. While our boy struggled to get through them with both hands, his knight was casually knocking them out with a single finger, not even breaking a sweat. Talk about a giga chad. Next up was 100 pole swings. Once again, our dude was struggling to even lift the empty bar, while Barros handled a boulder with such finesse that it looked like he was swinging around a lollipop. They both then did 100 squats, and once again, Karnak was struggling while my guy was just massacring the routine. Finally, it was time for our boy to catch his breath. Afterward, they had another meat-heavy meal, and the routine continued. Push-ups, pole swings, and squats, and they repeated this for every day for 15 days straight. After those 15 days, we see Karnak doing some squats, and his body has definitely improved, showing much more progress than before. Barros walks into the scene and comments that it seems like his master has finally built up some stamina. Our boy reports back, saying that of course he has gained stamina after doing these grueling exercises for over 2 weeks, but he still feels he's nowhere near his junior's level. Barros points out that he did twice the training, so it's no surprise there's a big difference. Blondie then decides it's time to start some sword training. He offers Karnak a sword and tells him to hold it. Once Karnak takes it, Blondie examines his posture and technique but is utterly disappointed. Everything about Karnak's form is a complete mess, and Blondie has no idea where to start because it's all so disorganized. A while later, Karnak has finally started to look somewhat decent with his stance, and at least now he won't be beheaded in one attack. Blondie then warns him that he's about to attack, so he better brace himself for the impact. With that, Barros swings his rod at Karnak, tagging him with a single quick strike. Blondie sternly tells him to get back in his stance and stop standing like an idiot. But the barrage of attacks Barros sends his way is just too overwhelming for him to handle, and the only thing Karnak can manage to do is maintain his stance. He doesn't even have time to think about defending himself. Eventually, after taking a solid blow, he stumbles backward and falls to the ground. Barros then tells him that he got a grip on himself, because the enemy don't give their opponents any chance to counterattack. He tells Karnak that he needs to hold his stance and dodge the subsequent attacks. But Karnak, frustrated, explains that even if he holds his stance, he simply can't dodge the next attack. Barros then reminds Karnak that the main goal of this training is to prepare him to have nerves of steel and to make sure Randolph gets the message that he's not going to back down. You see, Randolph has a habit of showing off, so he'll likely try to flaunt his skills in front of the spectators while toying with his opponents. However, if his opponent loses their will to fight, it's a different story, and Randolph will see it as a chance to end the fight quickly to protect his honor. So, Karnak needs to show Randolph that he's got balls of steel and won't give up, no matter how tough the circumstances get. If Karnak can prove that, he'll at least avoid dying in one hit. With only 5 days left before the duel, our boy is still pushing through his training, and it looks like he's improved quite a bit. But just as things seem to be going well, he takes a direct hit and goes tumbling backward, hitting the ground like a sack of potatoes. Blondie, clearly annoyed and furious with his lackluster skills, sternly warns him that if he keeps this up, he'll get slashed down in a single slice. Looks like even Karnak has gotten tired of taking all the flack from his friend, and is visibly frustrated. With only 4 days remaining, he's still getting his ass kicked by Blondie, and day 3 looks even worse, and he seems to be regressing instead of progressing. On day 2, after yet another failed attempt, he's utterly exhausted and sprawled out on the ground. He's convinced that if this keeps up, he might be dead before he even gets the chance to fight Randolph. Finally, Blondie reassures him that he's done quite well, and that this might be enough for the fight. He then further reveals that he will now teach him the 4 Martial King's sword technique. Karnak is confused to hear this, and asks if Blondie even knows such a technique. Blondie casually admits that he does, saying he knows most of the techniques because the 4 Martial Kings were all his underlings. He's learned all their techniques except for Martial King Rapisol's. Karnak inquires why he hasn't learned hers then. In response, Barros explains that we apparently failed to turn her into a Death Knight, and she resisted until the end, so our boy eventually had to cut her into thirds and make her a palace gatekeeper. Naturally, this idiot reflects upon his actions, and thinks to himself if he was that cruel. Blondie brushes off all the past talk, and tells him that today, He'll be teaching him Martial King Levon's Delphiad sword technique. Karnak isn't sure if he can learn this in just 2 days, but Blondie confidently states that 2 days are too much, because they only need 1. The scene then transitions to the day of the duel. The battle arena has been set, and people are already gathering. The arena is located smack dab in the middle of the Deventor and Jestard border. People are chatting among themselves, and it seems most of them believe Sir Randolph is going to win. As the murmurs continue, our boy arrives at the battle arena, accompanied by his knight as usual. For some reason, he looks quite confident, like he has an ace up his sleeve. I sure hope he does, because I don't want to see him getting beheaded right away. As the crowd thickens, an old man among the high-ranking officials overseeing the duel stands up and grabs everyone's attention. He quickly calls for silence in the presence of the allium. He then explains that both houses have claimed ownership of the copper mines, and that a trial by combat will decide who rightfully owns them. He then addresses Karnak of House Jestard, instructing him to come forward and face the goddess, and our boy Karnak steps forward promptly. From the other side, the old man also calls Sir Randolph of Deventor to come forward and face the goddess, and this cocky shithead also steps forward. The old man explains the rules, stating that both combatants have been given handicapped equipment based on their abilities. He then asks them in the name of the allium if they pledge to fight honorably. Both fighters swear loudly and clearly. With that, the old man announces the start of the battle. The two contenders finally stand in the ring, facing each other. The cocky guy grabs his wooden sword confidently and charges at our boy like a raging bull. He brings the sword crashing down, making it clear that even with the handicap, he's determined to kick our boy's butt. But our guy doesn't falter. He counters with a jab, saying they'll only know the outcome once they've seen things through. Their hack-and-slash battle continues. While Blondie swings his sword left and right with little regard, Kanrak keeps blocking the attacks with his thick shield. The people standing on the sidelines are amazed that our boy is actually putting up a good fight. One of them, feeling confident, even bets that there's something different about him this time. Meanwhile, Barros observes the battle quietly, and notes that things are unfolding as expected. Blondie is trying to appear fast and threatening to assess his opponent's strength. On the other hand, Karnak is also pleased with how smoothly things are going, and to seal the deal, he lets out a giant roar, confidently challenging his opponent to come at him. Blondie quickly perks up to see his determination in our boy's eyes despite his lack of skill. So to make sure Karnak does not get too full of himself, Randolph decides to up the ante. He raises his giant sword with ultimate speed, and Karnak suddenly feels a chill running down his spine as Randolph's sword energy surges. He realizes he won't be able to block this next attack with his shield as he usually does. Karnak decides to put his training to use and rolls away from the fight with surprising speed, creating quite a distance between himself and Randolph. It's a bit of a ridiculous move, and Randolph is totally bewildered by what he sees as a trashy tactic. Even the crowd is not sure whether to feel proud of their lord or to laugh at this weird rolling move. Even the overseer of this fight is intrigued by this unconventional move. Karnak then throws away his shield, showing he doesn't need it to defend himself. He pulls out his sword and starts throwing jabs, taunting Randolph by calling him a slow ass and a muscular pig who should be ashamed to call himself a dignified knight. Randolph is absolutely furious, but Karnak remains cheeky, continuing to deliver some sharp jabs that are making this cocky guy even more furious. Finally, Karnak takes his stance, and it doesn't take long for Blondie to recognize it as the Delphiad sword technique. The crowd begins to murmur in astonishment, because this stance was created by the legendary Martial King Levon. The people are amazed that Karnak is actually using a stance from one of the 4 martial kings, and the Jestard supporters become hopeful that their lord might win the match. Meanwhile, Blondie gets his head back in the game and thinks to himself that he got tricked by the taunts. He knows he just needs to stay calm and focused to win. Even though our boy is using a legendary technique, he's still far from mastering it, and Blondie is ready to take advantage of that. He then confidently points his sword at Karnak and boldly declares that he's ready to fight, no matter the cost. At this point, Karnak is starting to lose his cool, because the way Randolph is glaring at him is absolutely terrifying, and he wonders how this guy isn't scared at all. That's when the scene flashes back to the past, where Barros tells Karnak that he doesn't need to actually master the technique in 2 days. He just needs to roughly copy it. He further reassures our boy that he won't even have to swing his sword once he shows everyone that he's undergone some intense training, and he is sure that this will become the key to win this match. Or so these two idiots had thought. Unfortunately, it looks like their plan has backfired miserably, and now our boy is getting pummeled by Randolph like a punching bag right in front of everyone. After taking so many hits, Karnak finally retaliates, but it's clear that it's still not enough to get away Randolph's beating. By now, this absolute shithead has started crying out loud, with literal tears streaming down his face, but despite all the punishment he's enduring, he keeps talking big. He taunts Randolph, asking if he really thought his measly sword attacks would be enough to defeat the bloodline of House Jestard. On the other hand, Randolph is utterly boggled out of his mind, and he can't quite figure out what's going on with this idiot who's still talking tough even after all this beating. Surprisingly, it looks like Karnak's trick is working as intended. The crowd is starting to admire his boldness, and they're even calling out to Randolph, asking if he's getting scared. Let's not forget about Barros as well, and he is grinning from ear to ear because his master plan is actually working in their favor. He's glad that all the beatings Karnak is taking are paying off, turning the tide of public opinion in their direction. All of this is starting to get to Randolph's head, and he's absolutely irritated by our idiot's shallow bravado. He steps back and demands to know why Karnak keeps talking big when he's clearly on the verge of defeat. And honestly, Randolph isn't far from the truth. As much as I hate to say this, our main guy looks pretty pathetic right now. Fed up with the whole charade, Randolph decides he's had enough and dashes toward Karnak, ready to end this once and for all. Just then, Barros perks up with excitement and reminds Karnak that the time has come. He tells his master to brace himself. To understand what these two idiots have cooked up, let's rewind a bit. Earlier, the junior had taught his senior that even if he could mimic the moves without the proper strike, everyone would see through his tricks. He also taught him exactly how to execute that crucial strike. In the present moment, Karnak reflects on Barros's teachings and correctly anticipates that Randolph will target his legs to limit his movement and end the fight. As soon as Randolph's sword is about to strike his feet, Karnak quickly places his sword in between, blocking the attack like it's no big deal. This rattles Randolph even more, throwing him off completely. He can't believe a newbie just blocked his attack. Karnak seizes the opportunity and quickly swings his sword upward in a diagonal arc. The unexpected hit makes Blondie stagger backward, and without wasting any time, Karnak switches his grip and strikes Randolph again, this time aiming for the chest. With this double uppercut slash, he finally manages to draw blood from Randolph, though he looks absolutely exhausted, as if he just ran a marathon to the moon. But, to his dismay, all his effort results in nothing more than a minor graze on Randolph's body, and Randolph just laughs at the pathetic attack, mocking him, saying a kitten's scratch would have done more damage. At this point, Karnak is totally convinced he's screwed. The judges up top can see the match is pretty much decided, and the crowd is losing faith in him, commenting on how cruel and unfair reality can be. Even Randolph starts to feel a bit sorry for our boy, but Karnak tells him to stop celebrating too soon, warning that enjoying victory before it's really over might be risky. It looks like our idiot might have an ace up his sleeve, especially the grin he is flashing is telling me all. Just as expected, the minor graze on Randolph's chest starts burning with dark energy. Before Randolph can figure out what's happening, this dark energy bursts out of his chest, leaving him screaming. The crowd is stunned, trying to wrap their heads around the scene. One of the old men watching quickly notices the strange aura. Meanwhile, Blondie swings his sword, trying to cut down the dark energy. Karnak takes his chance and charges at him with everything he's got, yelling that he won't be beaten by Randolph's dirty tricks, even though it's really our idiot who's pulling off these weird stunts. Just as Karnak is about to land a solid hit, Randolph's leg moves on its own and gives a devastating kick to our idiot, which sends him flying away with sonic speed. Even the ground beneath him breaks apart due to the intensity. The crowd is terrified by the sheer power Randolph just displayed. That's when Barros takes his cue and quickly accuses Randolph of being a necromancer, claiming he's using dark magic from the devil. The old man up above immediately orders his knights to take down Randolph. As everyone, including the old man, leaps into action, they're all flung backward by the sheer force of that dark aura. The knights land hard on the ground, while the old man manages to land back on his feet. At this point, the old man is absolutely convinced that Randolph is definitely using necromancy, no doubt about it. He makes it clear that they need to stop him at all costs. Meanwhile, poor Randolph is completely bewildered. He's trying desperately to get rid of the dark magic, but it just won't go away. He's convinced that Karnak must have done something shady. Karnak, on the other hand, comes back after taking that brutal hit, and stands among the crowd. He's grinning maniacally while gesturing with his finger to manipulate this dark energy he has sent over this dude. The dark energy quickly surrounds Randolph and starts choking him. One of the soldiers then reports to the old man that Randolph looks like he's being controlled by a curse. The old man quickly dismisses this, reminding him that Randolph is still an unskilled user of his powers, and his own dark magic is starting to control him. They have no choice but to take advantage of this perfect opportunity and kill him right away. With that in mind, everyone charges forward with their weapons drawn. Meanwhile, Randolph, crying his eyes out as he's squeezed by the dark energy, is brutally struck by javelins from all sides. Blood pours from his mouth and wounds as he's pierced with so many holes. Finally, he collapses to the ground. The knights quickly check and confirm that Randolph is no longer breathing, and the old man orders them to send officials to Viscount Devontor's estate to investigate thoroughly. The old man then reaches his verdict, declaring that the fighter from Devontor has called upon dark powers and dueled in this holy trial, disgracing the name of their goddess. With that, he hands the victory to Karnak, the fighter from Jestard. The scene then cuts to the estate of Viscount Devontor, where chaos has descended upon the mansion. Officials have infiltrated the mansion, thoroughly searching every nook and cranny. They've already uncovered blankets and cloaks marked with necromancy symbols, along with other damning evidence scattered throughout the estate. Randolph's sister, however, quickly denies these bullshit accusations, stating that all those items were recently purchased from a peddler and have nothing to do with necromancy. One of the officers then asks her about a suspicious bottle of medicine found in Randolph's room. The woman nervously explains that it's just a hair growth formula they got from a merchant because Randolph had always been worried about his hair loss. But the officer dismisses her explanation, stating that this is solid evidence of necromancy. He informs her that a hearing will be held soon to address these serious accusations. A few days later, at the estate of Jestard, we find a spread of delicious food laid out on the table. Karnak and Barros are digging in like it's their last meal on Earth, enjoying their sweet victory. They're having the time of their lives, savoring every bite, and debating whether they should eat like this when there's already a party going on in the town square. But then the junior asks his master how he managed to pull off that spell, to which Karnak replies that he had to do whatever it took to win, and it only worked as well as it did thanks to Randolph's fiery personality. The scene transitions to a month earlier, where Barros is concerned and asks Karnak if he's seriously considering using necromancy, warning that it could get them into deep trouble instead of helping them out of it. The senior quickly agrees to this, and further explains that using necromancy is dangerous and could get them killed if discovered, whether they are using during the duel or not. With that in mind, he then reveals his plan, which is that if Randolph is suspected to be using a necromancy, then he is officially screwed. And since the officials will be sitting far away, they wouldn't be able to tell who cast the spell first. Our boy had already planned to act like he was getting pummeled by his opponent, so people might think Karnak is an idiot for getting beaten up like this. But that works to his advantage. The spell he's planning to cast is an incredibly high-level necromancy skill, so no one will suspect him of pulling it off. However, there's a catch. The spell only works if he can spill some of his opponent's blood, but with his current skills, Karnak isn't sure if he can pull it off. That's when Barros, ever the strategist, flashes him a thumbs up, telling his senior not to sweat it. He further assures him that with the master plan he has in mind, they will definitely make that bastard bleed. Back in the present moment, Karnak is feeling a bit down, grumbling about how rough it was to get beaten up so badly. Blondie, however, is all smiles, reassuring him that it was worth it in the end, reminding him of their victory. Still, Karnak is confused about why everyone is so convinced that Randolph indeed used necromancy. He is not sure what the allium priest had found during their investigation, which led them to think that Randolph is actually a necromancy user. It doesn't quite add up in his mind, and he's curious about how everything played out so perfectly. The scene then transitions to the Grand Temple of Allium, where we see the old man again, who is actually an allium priest, by the way. He questions his loyal lackey about the investigation into Devontor's dark powers, emphasizing that only confirmed facts should be reported, given the seriousness of the matter. The lackey respectfully confirms that their investigation is conclusive, revealing that the bottle found in Randolph's possession contains something far more sinister than what any ordinary necromancer would use. He further reports that the bottle holds a fragment of the transcendent, a dark power that the goddess herself had warned them about. The attributes matched perfectly, confirming the presence of a dangerous, forbidden force, known as the darkness of the apocalypse. On the other hand, our clueless idiot is on cloud 9, dancing around with joy, feeling like everything's finally going in his favor. They're savoring their success and planning to live it up, knowing they've achieved a big win. As they stroll down the corridor, Barros brings up a crucial point. Even though they've dealt a blow to the Devontor family, there are still plenty of other powers that might try to seize control of the mines. Karnak agrees, mentioning that's exactly why he's working on enhancing his necromancy. Barros also reminds him about the Grand Temple of Allium. If they find out about their necromantic activities, it could spell trouble. Karnak, with a mischievous grin, replies that this is precisely why he needs to figure out how to use necromancy without getting caught. In the middle of the night at the Jestard residence, Karnak is deep in his necromancy practice, focusing intently on filtering negative energy from the moonlight. He's calling upon the corrupt energy, carefully purifying it to collect only the pure essence behind it. Surprisingly, he manages to pull it off, successfully conjuring what is known as chaos magic through his necromancy powers. It's clear that Karnak's skills are evolving, and he's starting to tap into some truly formidable magic. In the morning, we see Barros is in a training session with the senior Jestard knight, Gilliman. Despite the knight's best efforts, Barrows can tell that his abilities are quite underwhelming. When Gilliman decides to take a break and end the session, he's practically about to faint from exhaustion, while Barrows remains as cool as a cucumber, as if the whole session was nothing more than a light warm-up. Barrows then gives his senior a compliment, saying that he's improving and could become the strongest knight of Jestard. But let's be real, Barrows is just being nice, knowing full well that Gilliman's skills still have a long way to go. Later, Barrows bursts into Karnak's room with tea in hand, only to nearly get roasted alive when Karnak accidentally shoots magic in a random direction. He is absolutely annoyed at his junior, and tells his friend to always knock before barging in. Barrows points out that the magic he just saw doesn't look like necromancy, but more like mana. Karnak gives him props for noticing this much, and explains that he's discovered a new way of doing magic, one that's more like mana. Barrows notes that using mana is only possible if he switches his powers. He further goes on to explain that there are 4 ways to transcend human force in this world. The first one is Knight's Battle Aura, the second one is Mage's Mana, and the third one is Cleric's Divinity. And lastly, Necromancy, which deals with death and darkness. He says that each transcendent force accumulates energy suitable for the user's body. Once enough force is accumulated, it transforms into a power optimized for the user's soul and body. So you can't use another power once your soul has already been compatible with one. Keeping everything in mind, Barrows asks his senior how he managed to switch up his power, since you can't just change it. Karnak explains that he didn't actually change his power. He just upgraded it to its second stage. He goes on to say that necromancy uses death and corrupt energy, which is kind of like dirty mana. It works well with his background, since he had a rough upbringing. He then compares it to fermented foods such as cheese, which are processed in a way that makes them less gross. His power has been cleaned up to avoid that dirty feeling. The nasty emotions like hate and grudges are filtered out, leaving just the pure energy of darkness and death, which then turns into chaos mana. It looks like normal mana but with a darker twist. Barrows nods, saying it definitely looks like mana now. Our boy then points out how he can now easily pretend to be a mage. Barrows then curiously asks if he can also mimic the kind of strength he had back then with chaos mana. But Karnak quickly shakes his head, saying he doesn't want that kind of hardcore power. All he needs is enough power to protect the territory. The scene then transitions to the western forest of Jestard territory. It looks like the knights of the Jestard family are cleaning out all the monsters from the mines. Just as they're about to leave, a monster lurks in the shadows and suddenly bursts out of the woods to attack the senior knight, Gilliman. But before the monster can tear him to shreds, Barrows leaps into action and takes the beast down with a single swing of his sword, sending it crashing to the ground. As he lands, Barrows asks if he was late, and asks if everyone is safe. Gilliman quickly responds, thanking him for the help and saying he feels much safer with an official knight around. Barrows just laughs it off, saying he hasn't been a knight for that long, and it still feels a bit awkward and embarrassing to be called with such a big title. Barrows then starts questioning the recent behavior of the monsters, pointing out rumors that they've been acting unusually strange lately. Gilliman confirms this, saying that these creatures have become at least twice as strong and that the rumors about it might actually be true. Barrows asks what he means by rumors. Gilliman explains that it's about the goddess's oracle. This oracle, sent by the 7 gods who protect the world and humanity, foretold a dire prophecy. The oracle spoke of a coming emptiness that would bring forth a darkness that erases light and reaps life. It predicted that hardships would arise, wrong beings would gain corrupt power, and death would awaken and walk the land. The king of death would come and paint the world with blood and tears, becoming the end that speaks of destruction. After the oracle's prophecy, monsters from a nearby continent began to go wild, and necromancers became uncontrollable, causing accidents everywhere. The continent's religious orders have gathered together to prevent chaos, and began fighting against the threats under the goddess's blessing to protect the world. Once he's back in the office, Barrows brings up the oracle with his senior. He points out that there was no mention of such an oracle before the regression, so he's confused about why the past seems to be changing. Karnak admits he's feeling annoyed too, as they still don't have enough information. Blondie even wonders if the oracles and rumors are related to them, asking if they might be somehow involved. Karnak responds that the timeline doesn't add up. The oracle was from long before their regression. This makes sense of why they could so easily pin the blame for necromancy on Randolph. Barrows feels absolutely devastated to think that with the world potentially collapsing, their chance to live peacefully might be slipping away, and he has no clue what they should do to prevent this mess. Karnak, sounding resigned, says there's not much they can do. After all, they're just country bumpkins with no real influence. Barrows then points out that he's not sure who the King of Death is in this world, or how he's going to bring about such destruction so easily. They eventually decide to leave the mess to the heroes and let them figure it out. and they both agree to only focus on enjoying their lives in their territory. About 7 days later, a visitor arrives at Jestard. The man introduces himself as a representative from the Goddess of Sun's order, Latiel. He seeks cooperation from our boys for his cause. Although Karnak and Barros had hoped to avoid getting tangled up in this oracle business, it looks like they're being dragged into it anyway and aren't thrilled about it. The visitor explains that there are rumors of a necromancer who fled from Death City to Jestard. He's certain that the necromancer is hiding in a nearby forest and requests a guide who knows the area well. Barros silently and desperately hopes his master will reject the visitor's request. But Karnak, however, tells the man that he'd be glad to assist with the goddess's cause. The priest perks up in happiness and is eagerly looking forward to working with our boy. Once the visitor leaves, Barros angrily turns to his senior, reminding him that they had agreed not to interfere with worldly matters. Karnak explains that this is a good chance to get a gist on the situation about what is going on. Barros then curiously asks his senior what he's going to do about it. In response, my guy gets absolutely devilish while stating that they'll catch the necromancer first to investigate him. Meanwhile, the necromancer in question is running through the jungle, and he is still not sure if he left behind those followers of the goddess, or they are still hot on his heels. Just as he's fleeing, he's suddenly blinded by a bright light, and soldiers surround him, demanding he stop immediately. The necromancer realizes why he's been running around so freely. It is because the soldiers were just waiting for him to fall into their trap. Once he is surrounded and ordered to stop immediately, he's told that no further commotion will be tolerated. In frustration, the necromancer grits his teeth and begins to unleash his necromancy powers. With a final roar, he releases all his terrifying energy, summoning an undead creature from the dark energy around him. One of the soldiers quickly instructs his subordinates to use the protection charms, but they prove utterly useless against the necromancer, and the dark energy lashes out, zapping the soldiers as if they were nothing more than ants. Meanwhile, our duo is perched on a tree branch, thoroughly watching the action happening down below. Karnak is seriously annoyed by how poorly the necromancer is using his spells and techniques. When they spot him running, they decide to follow, planning to get ahead of him before he's caught. The necromancer, running on fumes, finally ducks into a tunnel, hoping to hide. Just as things seem like they can't get any worse, he sees our duo casually chilling in the tunnel, waiting for him. As soon as they see him, Barros waves his hand, while Karnak casually says they've been waiting for a while. They get up, and the confused necromancer asks who they are. Karnak doesn't give a straight answer, and just reminds him about the soldiers who were after him. The necromancer starts to feel threatened, and quickly calls his shadow servants, and starts heading out of the tunnel, thinking his familiars should be enough to handle these two brats. Barros is quite impressed by the number of spirits the necromancer has conjured, though he's not too worried since he can easily cut them down. He asks Karnak what he should do next. Karnak tells him to just stay put because he wants to test his chaos mana in action. Meanwhile, the necromancer is running for his life, thinking that Karnak and Barros should be busy dealing with the monsters. His anxiety spikes when he sees the entire tunnel explode in a massive blast. He's left utterly bewildered as Karnak and Barros emerge from the rubble, asking him where he's trying to run off to. With a flick of his finger, Karnak conjures a ball of fire that quickly incinerates the black spirits, demolishing them in a single blow. The necromancer is blown away by this display and asks if our boy is a mage. By now, he is sure that he is in over his head and that these two are way stronger than he initially thought, so he decides to reveal his true power. He summons forth his most evil spirit, preparing for a final showdown. Once again, Barros is intrigued by how much energy this necromancer has, while Karnak is puzzled by why this stupid head is calling this spirit evil when it's actually a wraith spirit. The necromancer, growing cocky, claims he can see the fear in their faces. Karnak, however, is thoroughly annoyed to see a newbie getting cocky to him. The necromancer finally orders his own spirit to advance. As the wraith spirit charges at him, Karnak remains calm and composed, and in the next moment, he commands the spirit to kneel. The wraith spirit immediately drops to the ground, bowing before Karnak with a tremble, unable to resist the command of the King of Death himself. The necromancer finds himself stunned on the spot when he realizes that Karnak is actually a necromancer. Karnak is annoyed as usual. Scratch that. He's always annoyed, and this time, he is annoyed because this newbie took a lot of time just to figure out that he is a necromancer as well. He then decides to show off his biggest card, which is known as Misdirection. A giant green hand materializes with his single command, and as Karnak clenches his fist, the hand grabs the necromancer in its grasp. After a while, the necromancer is completely immobilized. Karnak uses a similar spell that he used over his butler, turns this man into his puppet, and commands him to get up. The necromancer complies immediately. Karnak then asks how he gained his necromancy powers. The guy explains it was pure luck. He was just drowning his sorrows in the street when darkness from an alley engulfed him, and he was infused with what he realized was the authority of the apocalypse. After getting the power, he grew stronger quickly, using it to eliminate those he disliked and sneak into a mansion. After interrogating the Necromancer, Karnak is disappointed to find that this man is just a random nobody with no useful information. His junior then quickly asks what they should do with this shithead, and our boy quickly walks toward this unconscious man and begins to absorb his necromancy powers. Questions why he is taking his powers, given that he's supposed to avoid dirty energy like this. Karnak explains that he needs to investigate this further, so he's only taking a small amount of power before the search party arrives in the scene. Suddenly, Karnak begins to feel something strange about this power. His junior quickly asks him if he is all right. At that moment, the voices of soldiers who were chasing the Necromancer become audible. Karnak tells his junior that there's something unusual about this power, but before he can reveal anything further, he decides to head back before the soldiers arrive. A few days later, we see our duo standing inside a soundproof barrier that Karnak has conjured. The junior asks why they need such a serious setup, to which Karnak replies that this is no ordinary matter. He then explains that he took a closer look at the necromancy power he collected the other day. When the junior asks if he found anything particular, Karnak reluctantly admits that he himself is actually the source of this power. This revelation completely baffles Barros, and he is absolutely confused to hear this. He quickly began asking how this could make sense since they arrived after the oracle was made. Karnak admits he has no clue, but is 100% certain that this power matches his own perfectly. He then reminds his junior that the reason they chose regression over possession was because the bodies they would have possessed couldn't handle the spiritual power they had, so it didn't make sense to put all that power into their old bodies. So, when they chose to regress, they abandoned their powers and separated their souls to regress back into their original bodies. However, Karnak admits that he somehow managed to bring his powers with him during the regression. His necromancy powers, which were bound to his spirit rather than his body, crossed into the past along with his soul. Since his current body was unable to handle this excess power, it must have erased most of it. This revelation shocks Barros, who is stunned to learn that Karnak also managed to bring his powers into the past, and this only adds to his worry, because that power alone is enough to bring the entire world down to its knees, even if it's scattered everywhere. Barros asks his senior if he could just call his powers back, but his senior annoyingly gives him a casual example. If you drop a coin on the street, it's never going to roll back into your pocket. Not surprisingly, Barros grabs his head in utter frustration and states that they are screwed once again. He's seen the world get destroyed by these powers before, and doesn't want it to happen again. Their distant dream of a cozy life now feels like shattered glass. Looks like they have no choice but to go out and find the other fragment of his powers before they fall into the wrong hands. But Barros isn't exactly thrilled about going outside into the danger, because he is enjoying his life here pretty much. His senior, though, quickly promises he'll make sure Barros is well fed. A few days later, they set out on their adventure. After taking in the scenery, Barros admits it doesn't feel so bad out here. He's actually pretty glad they're not being chased this time, and it's giving him some positive, adventurous vibes. They're also relieved there are no signs of bandits lurking around, because they used to get harassed by them all the time, which isn't exactly something to be proud of. On top of that, they're glad to have some extra money this time. Their current destination is Dararth, where the last necromancer they caught got his powers. So our boy is banking on the idea that there should be clues there. Barros mentions that their journey still feels a bit unplanned, because the darkness of the end won't exactly walk itself to them. So he asks his friend if he has any tracking magic they can use. Karnak says he doesn't have any tracking magic, but they can handle it the old-fashioned way. They're almost at their destination. Once they enter the town, their first stop is the Dararth Adventurers Guild. Karnak points out that this is the best place to gather information, which is exactly how they're going to find the darkness of the end. Barros then reminisces about their previous times, when they were able to flaunt their identities as adventurers, and those skills about to be proved helpful once again. However, the senior points out that things will be different this time, because there's no need for them to be adventurers anymore. Once they're inside the guild, they offer a hefty stash of gold to the attendant, who warmly welcomes his rich clients, and he is even willing to provide any information related to the darkness of the end. The senior quickly tells him they need every last detail. While the attendant goes through his shelves, he explains that there have been quite a few requests about the darkness of the end lately, so they have gathered a lot of information on it. After sifting through the shelves, the attendant pulls out a whole stack of documents on the matter. Right on cue, our both clueless boys begin skimming through the documents. However, they soon feel disappointed as they realize they've wasted their money on information that seems to be useless. One of the reports details how someone's mother ran off with a farmer. Another one mentions a stolen donkey. And there's even a claim about someone seeing Santa Claus, all blamed on the darkness of the end. The attendant offers to filter out the useless information, but our boy tells him to give them everything. Barros asks if it's really necessary, but his senior quickly places a hand on Barros's shoulder and explains telepathically that they'll use magical messaging to sift through the documents. Sometimes, important information is hidden among seemingly useless reports. Hearing this, Barros lets out a defeated sigh because he's frustrated and just wants to go home and enjoy some tender, delicious chicken meat. Suddenly, their attention is caught by the commotion nearby. A guy with red hair is yelling his head off about an evil necromancer in town, but no one seems to take him seriously. The red-haired man angrily rushes to the counter, insisting he needs to file a report about a necromancer who just appeared in town. The attendant asks if he's talked to the temple, and the man, clearly frustrated, says that the temple doesn't believe him either. The attendant then tells him to calm down and start from the beginning. Finally, the angry dude calms down and starts explaining. He says that a while ago, a figure named Cleo arrived in town and moved into an abandoned mansion. Despite his young age, Cleo had a lot of money and would throw town festivals to win people over with his charm. He seduced many of the young women in town with his strange skills, including his fiancée, Emily, and she is just begging to get laid with him. I guess it would have been better if he had kept this part to himself. As people overhear this man's story, they wonder if a young, handsome, rich man just enjoying the spotlight is really worth all this fuss. It sounds more like a common rich playboy situation rather than a necromancer. The redhead man is clearly annoyed by this, while other people tell him to just stop overreacting. Even the attendant apologizes, saying they can't accept the report. However, this greedy bastard then quickly flashes a price list and offers him the option to pay for a personal adventurer to investigate. The red-haired man's eyes nearly pop out of his head when he sees the amount of money required to hire one person. In the end, he storms out of the guild, fuming and telling everyone inside that they're going to regret this. Once he finally leaves, people inside the guild joke about how he was just jealous of someone else's good looks and romantic success. Meanwhile, Karnak feels dejected and disappointed that they didn't get any worthwhile information. So to lighten up their moods, Barros decides they should head to a nearby restaurant to unwind. As they begin to walk out, the attendant assures them he'll contact them if anything new comes in. Outside, Barros mentions that the Cleo guy does sound suspicious. His senior agrees, and they wonder why someone like Cleo would be in a small, rural town instead of a city. They soon realize that Cleo's interest in innocent country girls might be because he's after the souls of virgins. This suggests he's likely involved in some dark magic, which they shouldn't take lightly. After walking for a while, they finally see the town from a distance. Barros asks his friend for his take on whether there actually is a necromancer. To confirm, their friend quickly uses his magical powers and discovers a barrier around the town. It's very specifically made, so even a high-ranked priest would have trouble detecting it. This means the barrier's creator must be quite skilled. Barros then highlights that Cleo might not be part of the darkness of the end, and there is a possibility that he might just be an ordinary necromancer. They'll need to investigate further to find out. Suddenly, a voice calls out to them, and when they turn around, they're surprised to see a handsome priest approaching. The both of them are kind of shocked to see him, and they are not sure what he's doing out here. The man introduces himself as Alias, Rank 1, Inquisition of the Earth Order that serves Hatoba. Once they both realize that this man is a high-ranked priest, they are both a bit taken aback and unsure of what he might want from them. Nonetheless, Barros reluctantly introduces themselves to make sure they do not look suspicious or anything. Once Alias learns that our boy is a nobleman, he asks why they're here if they're not adventurers. Karnak explains that they heard some strange rumors and wanted to investigate. Hearing this, Alias gets excited and eagerly asks if they can help him with a favor. He mentions that it's for the goddess, and this dude is feeling so enthusiastic about it that both of our boys find his excitement a bit off-putting. They can't help but turn their heads away, feeling somewhat disgusted by his overly fervent demeanor. Eventually, Karnak reluctantly asks what the favor might be, and the priest leans in to whisper that there are rumors about a necromancer hiding out in this town. Not surprisingly, both of our boys are shocked to learn that the Order already knows about this necromancer, and what's even more surprising is that they only sent a single priest to investigate. Alias lets out a tired sigh and explains that the Order won't take action unless there is concrete evidence. They don't believe there's a necromancer in the town, because there's so much false information circulating these days. Karnak points out that the evidence they've already gathered seems suspicious enough. The priest responds that it's not hard to be considered rich and handsome in a countryside town compared to a city. In such a town, having a bit more money and being less tanned can make someone stand out as rich and handsome, even if they're not truly wealthy or attractive by city standards. So this is the only reason they gotta investigate a little more before jumping to conclusions. It turns out the only reason this priest approached them is that, just by looking at Barros and his well-used sword and armor, he could tell our boys are not pushovers. He is practically overjoyed, doing a happy dance as he excitedly says he's thrilled to be working with such skilled individuals. Barros and Karnak, however, aren't quite on the same page. They're both thinking, what kind of drag is this? And they are clearly not in sync with the priest's overly enthusiastic demeanor. They start talking through telepathy. Karnak tells his junior that the priest is pretty annoying, but they don't have much choice but to go along with him since they need to check a few things out. Barros raises a concern that if the priest discovers our boy is a necromancer, it could cause trouble. Karnak replies that he plans to erase the priest's memories if that happens. Well, we can tell that Barros is clearly uneasy about this, and he reluctantly admits that no one he knows has stayed sane after having their memories erased, and he can't help but look at Karnak with a scornful eye, seeing him as a bit too ruthless. Nonetheless, Karnak quickly flashes a big grin and shakes hands with the priest, faking enthusiasm and saying he's thrilled to work with the children of the goddess. They start their first investigation by walking through the bustling streets of the town until they reach the church. Inside, they are warmly greeted by the church staff. Town church head Graz and nun Julia are there to welcome them. After the pleasantries are over, they get to the main topic, and Graz claims that Cleo has been a great help to the town and is completely unrelated to necromancy. He mentions that a priest had visited before but left after a while after his investigation, suggesting that Alias's trip might have been in vain. But Alias quickly brushes it off, saying it's a good thing if they came here for nothing, as it would mean that no one is in danger. The scene shifts to an abandoned mansion surrounded by a powerful barrier. Inside, Cleo is seen brooding as his lackey reports that another person from the Order has arrived to investigate. Cleo dismisses him, telling him to report back only if he notices something off about the new priest. As the camera closes in on Cleo, it becomes clear that he's not the charming figure he's been portrayed as. Currently, he looks visibly irritated by the constant intrusion of priests. Meanwhile, back at the church, Alias shows our duo their room to stay. Once they stand there, Karnak points out that despite the church's positive opinion of Cleo, there's still a chance the entire town might have been deceived by him. Alias agrees, noting that it would be pointless to interrogate the townspeople further. They'll need to meet Cleo in person to figure out the truth. Our boy asks if it's really a wise idea to visit Cleo's mansion, but the priest reassures him that he has a plan in place. For it to work, they just need to follow his lead. As midnight strikes, we return to the abandoned mansion. Inside, Cleo is walking around when a servant carrying blankets asks him where he's going. Cleo simply says he's on his way to greet an unwelcome guest and tells her not to worry and to get some rest. The servant decides to leave for the night. Once Cleo is alone, his reflection starts popping out, which reveals a more sinister side of him. Instead of the charming young man he appears to be, his reflection looks more like an average monster. He grins ear to ear, satisfied with how his charm has been deceiving the townspeople. Cleo's twisted thoughts reveal that it's taken him almost half a year to prepare everything to summon the demon. He's excited that his efforts are about to pay off, but just as he's getting ready, another hindrance appears. He's glad he set up the detection barrier and plans to talk to the intruders briefly before sending them away. When he opens one of the gates, he finds the trio, Barros, Karnak, and Alias, and it looks like they are trying to swipe items from the mansion. Cleo is not sure who they are, and sternly demands to know their identities. The priest in disguise pretends to be shocked at their being caught and strikes up a conversation with Cleo. He asks if Cleo is indeed the young master of the estate, and mentions that they've heard he's been generously giving money to the townspeople, so they ask if he might spare some money for them as well. Cleo smirks as he dismisses them as nothing more than thieves in disguise. The priest asks why Cleo is laughing, while Karnak wonders if this shithead hit his head or something. Cleo becomes utterly cocky, raising his hand to unleash his ominous power. He calls the party worthless trash, unworthy of being anything but scraps. With those colorful words, he quickly sends a powerful attack their way. But the priest activates a barrier to block the direct hit, saving them in the nick of time. When they finally lay off their trashy disguise, the three of them finally appear as baddies who are ready to kick some ass. Cleo is visibly freaked out, gritting his teeth as he realizes he now has no choice but to fight these intruders to get rid of them. Without wasting a moment, Cleo quickly summons a horde of zombies. Barros and Karnak spring into action, while the priest decides to support them from the sidelines with his authority. In an instant, Barros moves so fast that he looks like nothing but a blur as he takes these mindless shitheads out one by one. Meanwhile, Karnak conjures his mana arrows and picks off the remaining zombies with precision. Seeing his minions quickly dispatched, Cleo has no choice but to deploy his trump card. And as reluctant as he might be, he eventually utters the chant, and a green portal opens up. Come forth a monstrous entity that crashes down from the portal like a goddamn meteor, and this horrifying monster is none other than the Demon Knight. Cleo's face lights up with a confident grin, believing that this powerful familiar will be more than enough to handle the trio. At that moment, the priest decides to take action. He quickly invokes his Light of Hatoba spell to cleanse the evil. As he completes the chant, a powerful flow of light strikes all the monsters in the room, including the demon knight. The light intensifies, causing the monsters to vanish as if they were never there. Cleo lets out a roar of disbelief, unable to handle the sight of his familiars disappearing into thin air. But the priest tells him to take a chill pill, and further states that he anticipated this and had the spell prepared. Cleo finally acknowledges that these guys are not really pushovers, so he's ready to reveal his final trump card to make sure he takes the win. A dark aura begins to radiate from Cleo, and his body starts to transform. His clothes shred and tatter as his muscles bulge and his veins pop out. With a final surge, he transforms into a stupid-looking barbarian-like figure. He looks like a total clown, and it's unclear why the priest seems so terrified of this shitty transformation, which seems more absurd than frightening. Honestly, the writer could have given Cleo wings, devilish horns, or even a monstrous form, but this transformation into an empty head barbarian wasn't what I was expecting for a final form in this arc. Regardless, Barros and Karnak leap into action. Barros jumps over the transformed Cleo and swings his sword with such speed that this bastard has no chance to block or deflect the attack. Meanwhile, Karnak shoots mana arrows that strike the enemy right in the chest. A while later, we see Cleo is down for the count, and he is surprisingly easy to defeat. Even the priest is baffled by how quickly and effortlessly they took down Cleo. On the other hand, Barros and Karnak haven't even broken a sweat. They look like it was just a warm-up before the main course. They turn to the priest and ask if they should finish Cleo entirely, or if he wants them to leave him be. The priest replies that he'll take care of the matter from here. The priest uses his magic to extract the dark energy from Cleo's body and begin putting it into a bottle. He then also confirms that it is indeed the darkness of the end. Well, this is exactly what our boys wanted to hear, and Karnak quickly taps the priest gently on the neck, and the priest slumps down, unconscious. Karnak then turns to his junior and tells him that they better start their investigation. Karnak examines the bottle and explains to Barros that Cleo was indeed a necromancer who managed to absorb some of the darkness of the end. He notes that such darkness is tempting because it grants immense power. He also mentions that Cleo seemed to be a cult member practicing something related to the reverse of Tesranic. Barros is confused to hear this, and promptly asks for more details about Tesranic. Karnak explains that Tesranic is considered the god of death. This surprises Barros, who thought our boy was the only one associated with the title of god of death, so he has no clue how anyone else could claim such a title. Karnak admits he's not entirely sure about everything, but according to the cult's gospel, Tesranic is the god of death and rebirth, considered an entity that will purify the world through death and create a new paradise. Barros then points out that Tesranic might be the reason behind everything that's happening. His senior quickly agrees, at least to some extent, given the information they have. Karnak then excitedly points out that he's gained something else from this encounter. With the power of a priest, he can now refine chaos mana more easily. When Barros asks if this was the reason he shook hands with the priest to collaborate, Karnak proudly confirms it. He explains that since chaos mana is purified and sealed necromancy power, he thought he could purify even more chaos mana by using divinity. Barros finds himself intrigued by this and points out that they should also keep an eye out for holy artifacts. Our fearless idiot then casually suggests they could just steal from a church later. And not surprisingly, his equally foolish junior totally agrees without a second thought. They then set about waking the priest, and when the next day arrives, we meet the priest again, who is feeling quite flustered due to last night's incident, admitting he probably let his guard down and got knocked out like that. Karnak assures him that everything turned out fine regardless of what happened last night, though he adds that the charmed townspeople seem confused after getting back to their senses. The priest reassures them that with the church's help, they'll calm down once they grasp the situation. The priest then asks where our duo is headed next, and our boys casually mention they're planning to rest in Dararth City for now. With that, they hop on their horses and start riding off, while the priest waves final goodbye and makes sure to give them the blessing of goddess Hatoba. As they disappear into the distance, the priest can't shake the feeling that there's something a bit suspicious about those two, but he can't quite put his finger on it. He then decides to dig deeper into both of them once he gets back. Meanwhile, our duo continues their journey, and before diving into anything major for the day, they decide to grab some delicious grub first. Late at night, a man was heard moaning from a house near the city of Dararth. Not wanting to die, the man confessed that he was a necromancer, and promised our heroes that he would tell them everything he knew about the power of darkness. Karnak was not interested in this information, and he told Barros to put the man in the water once more. Nothing extracts dark energy better than holy water. Our heroes managed to catch a few necromancers today, which was a good catch. After their arrival in the city of Dararth, Alias asked for their help again. This was surprising since they had never met before. On the other hand, it showed how much the priests needed help. Most likely the priests had investigated after Karnak's duel with Randolph. But it seems that all they found out was that our hero's family had been killed by necromancers, and that's why he now wanted revenge. So now they were given necromancer-related cases and many holy relics. This was an opportunity Karnak did not want to miss. He was determined to continue blocking the paths through which the darkness of the end spread. According to his observations, this power spread through gates in time. He needed to catch about 20 more necromancers to fully complete the research. Barros guessed it would take about 3 months, and in that time some massive event could happen. Approaching the house, our heroes found a letter from the Order of Hatoba. Alias wanted to meet with them and explain the details in person. There was a feeling that something great was being prepared. After a while, our heroes arrived at Hatoba's temple, where they were met by the always positive Alias. The first thing he did was to introduce Karnak and Barros to some 2 strangers. The guy named Reltane turned out to be a 6th Circle mage, while the girl whose name was Sarathi Allen was a swordswoman from the Adventurers Guild. These 2 were quite famous, as even our heroes had heard their names before. Mages and martial aura users in this world were divided into levels depending on their power. The more circles a mage had, the more powerful spells he could use. For example, once a mage reached the 10th circle, he became a being that transcends the limits of humanity. Aura users were divided by the color of their aura: red, blue, purple, silver, and finally gold. The higher they rose, the purer their aura became. Only the 4th Battle King could become a Golden Knight. Reltane was a 6th Circle mage, while Sarathi was a Red Knight. It was enough to call them backup. Thinking about it reminded Karnak of how Barros fought on equal terms with the 4th Battle King, despite never having studied martial aura. Approaching the 2, Karnak said that he had heard a lot about them, and it was an honor to meet them in person. But Sarathi immediately objected, replying that they were the ones who had managed to catch so many necromancers in such a short time. Alias was glad that the introduction had gone smoothly, but it was time to explain the purpose of their arrival. He did not hide anything, and honestly admitted that their order was in trouble. Just recently their order had been involved in a problem in Trist City, and it's been causing them problems since then. Trist City was located between the kingdoms of Eustil and the kingdom of Tarlor, and they both fought over this piece of land. After a while, the kings got tired of fighting and sent 1 nobleman each to marry. As a result, the Trist family was created to rule over the neutral lands. The city was located in a place that was very well suited for trade, which led to a rapid increase in numbers as well as wealth. But with this came problems, as the city authorities were unprepared to control and manage the large flow of new population and wealth. And as a result, power in this city was seized by criminal syndicates. Soon Trist turned from a prosperous city to a haven for criminals. The largest syndicates, the Ranfelts and the Plaths, expanded their power. The 2 clans claimed the heritage of Trist's bloodline and split the city, but they've been fighting to determine the true successor. The kingdoms, which had been troubled by the management of the city, agreed to acknowledge whichever side could rule the city properly as the new count. And so, the Ranfelts and Plaths fight continued on for decades. But the Plaths gained the upper hand ever since the darkness of Apocalypse took hold. The Plaths, who were involved in the slave trade business, worked with necromancers, who had similar goals. The Plaths then quickly began to attack the Ranfelts, but they drew too much trouble. The Ranfelts, having discovered the Plaths' use of necromancers, reported it to Order, and Hatoba Order made a move as soon as they confirmed the use of necromancy. The fight ended in the victory of the Ranfelts, and the Plaths were barely able to maintain their name. It all sounded like it was resolved. But the real problem was that the Ranfelts were also accused of using necromancers. It was just that unlike their opponents, they were good at hiding it. Sarathi wondered how the Order didn't know about it, to which Alias replied that it was hard for them to prove it in the wake of darkness of the end. Suddenly, Karnak intervened in the conversation, expressing his displeasure towards the necromancers. At the same time, he didn't seem to be ashamed of being one himself. Barros immediately grasped the point. The reputation of the Hatoba Order was at stake, so everything had to be done discreetly and carefully. If they messed up, it could lead to problems catching necromancers in the future, and the first thing Alias suggested was for their group to disguise themselves and infiltrate the city. But our heroes had a reasonable question why he entrusted this mission to them and not to the members of the Order. And though Alias was ashamed to admit it, he answered that he was afraid of information leakage in the Order itself. The previous group they had sent to the Ranfelts had disappeared without a trace, even though they were all experienced priests. They suspected that this was the work of Bishop Straff, a high-ranking priest who had helped the Ranfelts in their battle with the Plaths. Because of this, Alias acted on his own in secret from the Order. He was determined to find unequivocal evidence of Ranfelt's use of necromancy. Realizing the risks of this operation, Sarathi told Alias that it was very dangerous. The entire city could turn against them. Alias realized this too. He replied that this was why he had gathered them today. He believed that they were the ones who could survive even in the worst-case scenario. At the same time, in Renfelt Manor underground chamber, painful moans of people could be heard. These people were members of the Order who had been sent to the Ranfelts, and as one could already guess, they had failed to fulfill their mission. The guy standing behind the man wondered if it was time for the Order to do something again. A sinister smile appeared on the man's face. He was the same traitor from the Hatoba Order, Bishop Straff, and he was only too happy to have guests, as he would only have more victims. After killing a few more poor souls, Straff concentrated more dark energy in his hands. This caused concern in his subordinate, as such an amount could destroy Straff's body. However, the traitor priest was not worried about this, for he was protecting his body with the grace of the goddess. All he wanted now was for the Order to send truly formidable warriors. That way he could become even stronger. After some time, our heroes finally arrived in the city of Trist. As mentioned before, the city truly resembled ruins. Poverty, ruins, criminality, these were the words that best fit its description. In the criminality of this city, our heroes were convinced in a few minutes after arrival. Robberies in the middle of the day were commonplace here. Alias once again warned that if they did not want to find themselves in the same situation as the robbed Reltane, they should be vigilant. Fortunately, despite the dangers of the town, Alias knew of a safe place to stay, and they headed straight for it. You can see for yourself the reaction of our heroes upon arrival. They would never have thought that Alias would lead them to the mansion of the Plath's family, which he himself had brought to ruin. After a while, our heroes were sitting at the table with the current head of Plath's, Sildera. She did not excuse her family's guilt, and agreed that those who had touched forbidden magic should be punished, including her father. But at the moment, she also wanted the Ranfelts who had crossed the line to be punished. Alias agreed with her as much as anyone. He couldn't stand the Trist Paris commit anymore. In other words, it's Trist's fault, not Hatoba's order. And since their views converged on the matter, he suggested that they make an alliance in this operation against Ranfelt. Sildera agreed and asked what their plan was. In her opinion, one could not act rashly, for they had recently increased security, and it was only possible to approach the mansion if the person was of high rank. Too dangerous? No problem, because our genius Alias even had a plan for this case, and it was to ambush the Ranfelt's residence. Although at first glance it was too simple a plan, but Alias was sure that it would work. In Sildera's opinion, it wasn't a bad plan, since there weren't many military forces in the residence itself. But what bothered her was the lack of information about the presence of necromancers. However, in Alias's opinion, everything was fine. For this mission, he had just gathered people who were veterans in fighting necromancers, and their competence could not be doubted. And so, late in the evening, the operation to infiltrate the Ranfelt's mansion began. The plan of our heroes was to distract the outside guards with Molotov cocktails. Then, taking advantage of their confusion and surprise, to sneak into the mansion. But even though they managed to get past most of the guards unnoticed, they were already met at the entrance by a group of elite knights. Looks like it's more complicated than they thought. Did I say more complicated? Forget what I said. How could a squad of some knights be difficult opponents for such a tough team? In the next moment, the knights realized that they were nothing more than NPCs in this story. Just one spell from a sixth circle mage was enough to break their spirit and sow panic. Not to mention the deadly swordswoman Sarathi, who possessed a battle aura. The knights clearly didn't expect to see an aura wielder here. Karnak and Barros didn't even interfere for a while and just watched this battle, or rather one-sided beating. After criticizing Sarathi's sloppy movements a bit, Barros decided to warm up as well, and easily dispatched the opponents attacking them from behind. Karnak didn't stand idly by either, and disarmed a few opponents as well. Everything was going smoothly until they saw Alias fighting. At that moment, he looked more like a chihuahua possessed by the devil than a priest. Soon it was over, and the last surviving elite knight fled in shame. But despite the victory, it was too early to relax, as the necromancers never showed up. The only option left was the mansion building itself, where the advantage was on their side. Entering the mansion, our heroes noticed that it was too quiet. But it did not last long, because after a moment, they heard a voice. It belonged to one of the suddenly appeared people. The guy who spoke recognized their strength, but he was still sure that they had no chance against the power of darkness. He even laughed, thinking that the high-ranked undead specter behind him would be able to protect him. In his opinion, they had to look like strong and tough villains in their eyes. However, our tough team didn't care about that. For now, they had the evidence they were looking for in front of them. All they had to do now was to capture these bastards. Karnak and Barros were on the same line, and had already imagined how much they would be paid for these three. The necromancer didn't like this reaction at all, and in a rage he ordered the undead to take all the life force of the invaders. Alias entered the battle and used some sort of holy spell. The appearance of the priest shocked the necromancers, but they didn't have time to be surprised. After dealing with the high-ranked undead in just a couple of moments, Sarathi immediately rushed towards the necromancers. She was about to attack them, but suddenly their heads just burst like air bubbles. Alias thought that Sarathi had killed them, but it was not so. Strange and terrifying things were happening. The mansion was transforming right before their eyes. It took only a few moments for everything to change beyond recognition. No one realized what was happening. But suddenly a voice was heard, the owner of which seemed pleased by their arrival. A sixth circle mage, aura user, and even Inquisitor Alias. In his opinion, this was a great catch. Alias recognized the owner of the voice. His assumptions proved to be correct, and it indeed turned out to be Trist Parish's Bishop Straff. He didn't want to believe that the servant of the goddess had succumbed to the temptation of the forces of darkness. But he had. While they were talking, Reltane, along with Sarathi, tried to force their way out, but were defeated. The reason for this was simple. Inside this space, their powers were weakened by the darkness. Alias tried to get rid of the energy of death, however it did not work. His divinity did not work in this place. Moreover, Karnak noticed how the divine power that Alias used was feeding the powers of necromancy. According to Straff, our heroes were too naive to think that they had met real necromancers before. And he was right. They were wrong to think so. If that all there was to necromancy, why would the Seven Orders be so wary of the power of the dark? Turning to Alias, Straff asked what it was like for him to meet a true necromancer. What about Alias? He didn't know what to say, because he had really screwed up. At the same time, Karnak contacted Beros through the mental link and told him to get ready. It was really bad this time. And if they were unlucky, this place could literally be their grave. They really screwed up when they got into that barrier. It was created with a mix of divine power with the power of necromancy. And even Karnak himself had never seen such barriers before in his long life. And in that case, there was nothing he could do against such a barrier. All he could do was use his chaos mana to kill the mad necromancer priest and hope that without his power, the barrier would disappear. Beros was surprised. It was the first time he had ever seen Karnak not know some kind of spell. How could some hillbilly town priest manage to create a spell that even a former Death King couldn't recognize? Bishop Straff wasn't about to play with his victims, even if there was nowhere to run. No less vile creatures began to emerge from the abominable walls of flesh. Soon our hero's entire group was surrounded by these creatures. These creatures were necromancers' puppets, chaotic golems, and they were clearly not going to wait. Alias immediately protected everyone with the Hatoba shield. But the holy barrier didn't scare the golems at all. They began to strike blow after blow. The barrier began to crack and everyone realized that Alias wouldn't be able to hold it for long. Fortunately, Reltane only needed a little more time to prepare his spell, and he would try something. Reltane was ready to unleash violent flames that burned through everything. But he didn't have time. The priest's barrier had been broken before, and the two of them flew away like useless puppets, right at the feet of the other golems. And so the golems captured the priest and the high-ranking mage. But the battle was not over yet. Sarathi continued to fight the golems. She couldn't figure out why her attacks weren't doing any damage to the creatures, and so she was caught too. Bishop Straff now thought that it was all over since the other two guests were useless. Our heroes were in complete disagreement with this opinion. The golem clutched Sarathi, while the mad priest rejoiced at acquiring such a valuable and coveted soul. As expected, Bishop Straff underestimated our heroes and paid for it. Beros quickly released Sarathi, reminding her that he told her to be careful. Beros was well aware of the golem's vulnerabilities, and took advantage of it with a single precision strike to the golem's core. After that, the golem shattered into pieces. Surprised, Sarathi immediately asked how Beros was able to do that without using his aura. He explained to her that the weak points of chaotic golems were places where mana didn't flow. The only problem is that the mana flow is constantly changing, making it difficult to detect weak spots. But of course for Beros this wasn't a problem thanks to his experience. That was the end of his help for Sarathi. Now she had to defend herself, because if Beros ran out of stamina, he would be finished too. Now Sarathi was armed with knowledge, but she still had the question why Karnak was not helping them. Meanwhile, our hero was away from the battle and trying to figure out what was going on. At first glance, everything was bad. Even his necromancy wasn't working in this barrier. Even if he tried to imbue this fog with his own necromancy power, he still wouldn't be able to control it. It seemed that if things continued like this, they would lose to Bishop Straff. There was an urgent need to find another solution. The circle of golems was now shrinking even around Karnak. He finally came to the conclusion that there was no necromancy spell that he didn't know about. So something other than necromancy was involved in creating this barrier, and he had only one idea what it could be. Karnak was determined to test his theory. While Beros was massacring the golems one by one like little annoying things, Karnak was destroying them in whole groups. This was all starting to piss off Bishop Straff. He couldn't understand how that bastard was destroying his chaotic golems so easily. Only now did he realize that he shouldn't have underestimated those two. And perhaps before this battle, he should have absorbed the scrolls of necromancy sealed in the Hatoba Order's vault to gain even more power. It was obvious that chaotic golems were not enough and he needed to try something else. These two were suddenly too strong. To help himself, Bishop Straff summoned a spirit from another world and immediately sent it to attack. Karnak protected himself and Barros with a barrier, but unfortunately Sarathi was too far away from them. She tried to run away, but her speed was lacking. Our two were forced to admit that she was slower than expected. Sarathi realized that running away was pointless and tried to fight back, but her sword simply passed through the disembodied spirit without doing any damage. But when the spirit touched her hands, something happened. Sarathi was pierced with incredible pain and her hands became black and lifeless. The spirit grabbed her. Even an aura user like her couldn't do anything. This was all getting tiresome for Karnak. He had already realized everything and wasn't going to hide anymore. Karnak used his necromancer power and was going to show this amateur necromancer who the real necromancer was here. The barrier of flesh around him began to crumble, and our hero smugly noted that he was right. Bishop Straff didn't understand what was happening and why his barrier was falling apart, and the summoned spirit was disappearing. He only asked angrily what Karnak had done. Nothing really, as it is for the King of Death. Our hero had simply placed his own barrier on top of the Mad Priest's barrier. Karnak asked him how he could allow himself to act so high and mighty when he was really just an amateur. Bishop Straff was of course offended by such accusations, and was determined to prove otherwise by summoning his army of the dead from the underworld. Apparently even such an amateur necromancer had his own army, but it wasn't clear to Barros how that madman could summon so many dead even after his barrier collapsed. There was another problem. Against such basic necromancy, even Karnak couldn't do much. They would have to deal with these undead on their own and with their own hands. Except even Barros saw that these undead were not basic at all, but highly ranked. So why does Karnak call it basic necromancy then? The fight went on, but the more they killed the undead, the more appeared. It turned out that this mad priest had more power than they thought. At this rate they could fight this undead forever. Karnak realized that the longer they fought, the worse things were getting for them. They needed to take a break, and then they would have a chance. He was going to create an illusion. Gathering his strength in his fist, he unleashed a dark blade scattering all the undead around him. Who would have thought? But it was much more effective than a sword. Bishop Straff had to admit it was a good move, but he was sure that it was all useless against his overwhelming power. To demonstrate this, he summoned Demon of Gehenna right in front of our heroes. Demon of Gehenna immediately turned to the priest who had summoned him and demanded to name his wishes. He wished without a doubt for the demon to kill the two men and bring him the red-haired woman. But there was a problem. The demon didn't understand who he was supposed to kill and was furious about it. He didn't think of the illusions as people. Karnak's illusion only laughed at him. He had never met a necromancer who was so easily fooled by illusion. As soon as the priest's barrier fell completely, Karnak created this illusion that only a true amateur could fall for. All that Bishop Straff saw before him was an illusion that had now evaporated. But now it was too late to do anything, and he could only curse those bastards in rage. Meanwhile, our two were already far enough away to catch their breath. Karnak couldn't help but laugh at how much of an idiot their opponent was, able to focus on only one type of spell. But they had to decide what to do next. As Barros had correctly pointed out, it was too dangerous to go back to Plath's residence. The Ranfelts would look for them there first. Suddenly, Sarathi spoke up. She had finally come to her senses. She had seen everything and couldn't believe that Karnak had been lying to all of them all this time. Such a revelation did not embarrass our hero. Even on the contrary, he was glad that Sarathi woke up and asked how she felt. Sarathi in response advised him not to pretend to care for her, because he is a dirty necromancer. Where did they take her anyway? Karnak explained that right now they are hiding outside the city to avoid the barriers. Besides, they need time to heal her. Sarathi was surprised that they wanted to heal her and not kill her. There was one thing though. Then Karnak would erase some of her memories. Surprisingly enough, Sarathi didn't mind. Or rather, she didn't care. After she stopped feeling her hands, life lost all meaning for her. She wouldn't be able to live a normal life after that, let alone be a swordsman. In that case, she even asked them to kill her right here to end her suffering. Barros as a swordsman understood her best and he felt sorry for her. So he asked Karnak why they shouldn't try to use a healing spell from a skilled priest. But our hero had to remind them that they could not use holy magic. It would go against the natural order. In that case, Barros wondered if they could do something with necromancy. Suddenly Sarathi was very interested. She couldn't believe that Karnak could use necromancy to restore her hands. In fact, he could, but as always there was a catch. Karnak would not recommend that option to her. For it to work, Sarathi would have to become his servant. She certainly wouldn't want to be the servant of an evil necromancer. The first thought of this made her horrified. A necromancer can control a human soul to use it as a slave after a slave contract is made. Sarathi had heard many stories of captured adventurers who went through brutal tortures before meeting their end and giving their souls to a necromancer. She was horrified to even think about all of this, and it seemed impossible for her to accept such an offer. But she hesitated. Meanwhile, Karnak was asking Barros through the message system if he had mentioned all this on purpose. Of course, yes. Barros was sure he had no other choice. After all, he knew how she was feeling right now, and he wanted to give her hope. In that case, it was up to her. Karnak had assured her that he tried to stay away from using necromancy, and seeing her current state, he couldn't really give her advice on what she should do. But if she does decide to become his servant, she can regain her lost hands. The decision is up to her, and he is willing to do as she says. Sarathi had one last question. What happens when she becomes his servant? Karnak explained that once the contract is finalized, he will be able to see the structure of her soul. With that information, he would be able to rebuild her body. After that, although she will have free will, there will be a few restrictions placed on her, and if she betrayed her master, she would meet instant death. Sarathi came to the conclusion that although it sounded dangerous at first, it was not too different from the vow of loyalty that knights take. She was faced with a choice of what to lose, her freedom or her future as a swordsman, and the decision was left up to her. She finally made up her mind, and asked Lord Karnak to accept her as his servant. After making sure she was sure of her choice, Karnak proceeded to sign the contract. In the name of Karnak gestured Lord of Darkness, he asked her if she would become his servant, and Sarathi said yes. Now she had to open her mind and accept this contract of servitude. If she did so, she would regain what was lost. The process was not pleasant, and her body was filled with dark energy, but in return, her dead hands began to come back to life and return to normal. She could hardly believe her eyes. Sarathi was now officially a servant of Karnak. Her hands were with her again, and her happiness was unbounded. But there was no time to rejoice for long. There were plenty of problems, and they had to decide what they should do with the kidnapped Alias and Relthane. Karnak realized that Straff's necromancy was stronger than he thought, so it would be better to use large-scale necromancy instead of chaos mana. Barros knew that if Karnak used this method, the city would be destroyed. They were faced with two choices. The first was to prepare, build themselves an army, and then go save Alias and Relthane. The second was to just abandon them and run away from here. Barros pointed out that whichever choice they made would make them the bad guys. On that, they both agreed that being good was difficult. But Sarathi thought otherwise. For her it was simple, since saving her friends was the obvious choice. Barros wasn't so sure about that, because then they would have to use such a brutal method. Sarathi still stood her ground, certain that even if it was the best choice, they couldn't just abandon their friends. And that they would save their friends despite the potential danger was definitely the right thing to do. R2 didn't quite get it right and decided that if the intention is good, even evil methods are justified. There was no limit to their joy when they realized they could use necromancy and it would be justified. And the fact that Sarathi didn't mean it didn't bother them at all. Meanwhile, in the city of Trist itself, things were turbulent. The guards and warriors sent by Bishop Straff were looking for suspicious outsiders as best they could. All those who were not locals were caught in the crosshairs. Merchants were especially hard hit. The guards had an order to capture all outsiders, but there were also some who shirked their work and rested instead. When another guard noticed this, he immediately ordered him to move and work, to which the first one asked how dare he give orders. The second guard also did not do it willingly, but orders are orders. Suddenly his sword glowed with a green aura, and he attacked the first guard against his will. The resting guard was a bit shocked by what the other one was doing, but he wasn't going to retreat, even when the other tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding. Blood was spilled and the second guard was badly wounded. The others tried to stop them, ordering them to stop fighting and get to work. But when that guard turned towards them, the Karnak illusion made him look like a monster. Everyone immediately rushed at him to kill the monster. The poor guy didn't even know what was going on or what monster they were talking about. Karnak started it all. This city was so corrupt that it completely panicked as soon as the problem appeared, and the process of restoring the Necromancer King's power went easier than he expected. At the same time, it was a mystery to Sarathi why he had put on this show. Actually, Karnak was just making an undead army for himself. It was the best strategy to counter Bishop Straff, and luckily there was plenty of death energy in this cursed city. However, although there was energy, there were not enough bodies. Therefore, our hero had no choice but to make them. It's just a little evil that these two had to do to save their friends. At least that's how they reassured themselves. Sarathi didn't know what to say. If she hadn't convinced them of something like this, they probably would have just abandoned Alias and Relthane. Sarathi also noticed that Karnak, as a necromancer, wasn't as evil as the rumors said about them. He only victimized the Ranfelt warriors with his illusions, leaving the regular townspeople alone. Driven by their corruption and illusions, the bandits killed each other, remembering their old quarrels and conflicts. And so they died one by one, without realizing what was going on and who had started the whole slaughter. Sarathi was surprised by such cruelty, but our two were pleased with the progress. This number of corpses should have been enough to do the job for sure. Karnak began to take action, calling for his new army to awaken and rise up. His dark energy went straight to the square full of corpses, and the former bandits of the Ranfelt clan rose from the dead to serve the new master. This new army staggered unsteadily toward the residence of Bishop Straff. Watching this march of the dead, Sarathi realized how wrong she had been when she thought that Karnak was not so evil and cruel. Now all the streets of Trist were filled with an army of the dead. Karnak ruled them with his iron will, commanding them to move forward, while Sarathi regretted her decision to become a servant of someone like him and doubted her future well-being. Thus began the war between the two undead armies. Karnak's army had the advantage in numbers, but Straff managed to summon ugly gargoyles, which were quite successful in attacking the undead from the air. Watching this, Karnak once again noted that Straff's necromancy power was stronger than he thought. He was able to summon a death dragon and 7 trumpeters. Only our hero should have been able to use that spell. Although since the past had changed, maybe people were able to get some of the items that used to belong to him. Either way, he had to hurry before his real plan was discovered. Sarathi was shocked to learn that most of these zombies were just an illusion. Of course Karnak could gather such an army, but not in such a short time. Now she had changed her mind about our hero for the 10th time this evening, and happy that he wasn't so bad, she was already asking them to hurry up. Inside the Ranfelt residence, Trist was preparing another vile ritual, about to sacrifice Alias and Reltane. The sudden attack of these common zombies had taken him by surprise at first, but now he saw them as no threat. To him they were just pests despite their numbers. Among all these undead, he was looking specifically for the 2, those bastards who had recently escaped from him. Surely that Necromancer was behind this army. And while his attention was focused on the battlefield, he didn't notice the guests entering. Straff turned around in horror as he recognized the voice. He had only one question. How did they get here? Karnak reminded him that he said they would see each other soon, and as a king he was used to keep his word. Baron Karnak opened the second round with a cheeky insult at the bishop's exhaustion in dealing with the zombies outside. Alias and Reltane had been bound and knocked out on the sacrificial altar. Fortunately, they hadn't gone through the ceremony yet. Seeing the trio that had been messing with his plans, Bishop Straff was livid. He argued that they were mistaken for coming here, into his domain. Although it was true that he was weakened and tired, he was still powerful enough with the support of his own zombie army. As the undead surged towards their position, the knights immediately drew their blades. Without wasting another second, Barros and Sarathi met the zombies with a slash after the slash. Karnak also took advantage of the commotion to call the spirits from the depths of purgatory. With echoes of the underworld active, multiple demonic spirits made their entrance to provide support. The spirits went on to slaughter the zombies. Every contact they made resulted in death. Zombies fell, and their numbers thinned out, putting the bishop in a tight spot. It did not help that the knights were killing machines in their own right. As the clock kept ticking, more and more zombies were slain. After a while, none of them were left. The fallen bishop was exasperated as he watched his entire army get dispatched so easily. This forced him to pull out his trump card. He called Gehenna's demon once more. From the malevolent magic circle on the ground came the demon that was disrupted earlier. While Sarathi worried, Barros was unfazed. He was not impressed with the repeated summoning at all. Nor was Karnak. He found the bishop's style too repetitive, as his necromancy must have reached its limits by now. Taking advantage of the situation, Karnak launched a simple counter-summoning spell. His power started pushing the demon down, but it resisted with all its might. Karnak smiled and taunted the bishop and his pet demon. But the taunting made Gehenna's demon rageful and supercharged, brute-forcing his way out of the counter-summoning. Eventually, it managed to break free of the counter, causing quite a stir inside the creepy giant basement. Gehenna's demon was successfully summoned. With his blade in hand, he asked the bishop for his wish. Bishop Straff requested the death of the men and for the woman to be brought to him. With the request acknowledged, the deal with the devil was finalized. Karnak had not expected his counter to fail, and now they must face the suffocating pressure of fighting against a demon. Since it did not go as planned, Karnak just tasked his knights to go and fight that thing. They could either await their deaths or fight. The choice was pretty obvious. Even with Sarathi and Barros attacking in coordination, the demon's pure strength and defense proved too hard to pierce through. Their efforts were called laughable, an act of resistance from an insect. Gehenna's demon unleashed a counterattack that tore through the ground as the knights narrowly dodged out of the way. They managed to avoid the brunt of the attack, but its impact was still felt. Karnak remained calm, loading up a fire spell from afar to test the demon's resistance. Multiple fireballs took to the air, each one homing in on the demon's direction. The big red bald bastard did not even stress about those balls. He just raised his hand and absorbed everything. Sarathi reckoned that the demon had the fighting capabilities of a purple knight. Barros regretted not having awakened his battle aura yet. Hearing that stuff about battle aura made Karnak realize they always had Plan P. Barros stood up in realization as well, leaving Sarathi confused as to what this plan was. Karnak channeled his power into Barros's mind, carefully manipulating the mana inside. He started going on about his kin when it was clear that these two were not related at all. Then Karnak handed down the order to open his slave's mind and accept what was coming. Suddenly Barros's consciousness floated right into Sarathi's. You see, it's called Plan P for a reason. Plan P for possession. It had been a while since Barros took over someone else's body, but he managed to get in without any trouble. Karnak was pleased with himself, dubbing this hybrid as Sarabarros. Sarah did not like that at all. Charging forward, Barros apologized to the young woman for borrowing her body for just a bit. She could only wish for him to treat her body well and give it back later. Gehenna's demon laughed, thinking that a bastard who couldn't even use aura himself wouldn't be able to utilize someone else's aura. But he was gravely mistaken. Giving Barros a body capable of inducing aura was like equipping a sniper with a proper gun. With his first attack, he quickly showed the lethality of a red aura when used correctly, slicing the demon's stomach open. Barros was so feared in the first timeline precisely due to his expertise in using someone else's battle aura. The demon could also see that. Barros just aimed for his minuscule gap in defense perfectly. The power behind the slash was no joke. Pushing Sarathi's body even further, Barros managed to bring out a blue battle aura, surprising the young woman herself. Barros was just in awe of her body's latent power. Thanks to this jump in level, fighting would get a little easier and more comfortable. And so, the demon's body served as a training dummy to get sliced and diced in every way possible. Barros was doing so with a big bright smile. Gehenna's demon was being overwhelmed, and he hadn't even had the chance to fight back and show his own strength. Tried as he might to break through the relentless attacks, every movement he made just resulted in more injuries. Taking a breather down below, Barros avoided a well-timed counter by the demon. He laughed and taunted the demon to try harder. Gehenna's demon might look like a horrific beast, but the real monster here was Barros. Still, the demon's pride refused to give up. He just couldn't afford to take the L. He believed that if he somehow got Barros out of the girl's body, he would win. So, he launched a ranged attack aimed at the one who cast the spell, Karnak. The demon magic hit the ground, vaporizing everything around its destructive explosion. He laughed at the human's carelessness, which gave him an open shot. Then he heard Karnak's mocking voice. The Baron was laughing at the foolishness of the summoned demon falling for the same trick as the summoner earlier. Around the battleground, countless illusory figures of Karnak popped out one by one. The one that got bombed was also one of these dupes. For the King of Death, reading a demon's puny mind and tricks was child's play. Looking at the illusions made the demon stop in confusion. Just as he was agonizing over which one he had to kill, Barros was already staring down his body, which was just begging to be sliced cleanly. So Barros delivered a quick succession of attacks that butchered the demon alive. Gehenna's demon overexerted himself to forcefully get out of the counter-summon, but now he did not have enough mana to resist and recover. He never would have expected that he would suffer such a fate at the hands of a mere human. The door back to wherever he came from had already opened. With the summoning gate ready, Gehenna's demon left his enemies with a warning that once he got back, they would be done for. He would make sure that these humans wouldn't live or die, that they would suffer from something worse. Karnak refused to let this arrogant demon retreat after they diced him up. Using necromancy, he intended to finish the demon off once and for all. Instead of safely entering the summoning gate, the beast was caught in the tight grasp of necromancy magic. With the power entering through his wounds, the demon felt his mana flow backward. He screamed in agony as the inevitable drew closer and closer. Gehenna's demon could not handle his enormous pool of mana, which turned his body into a giant bomb. He exploded, shattering into countless minuscule pieces, literally deleted out of existence. With the big bastard taken care of, Karnak dispelled his illusions. Barros also returned to his own body, making Sarathi feel the pain of overexerting oneself in combat. He advised that she should turn off the blue aura to lessen the agony. Karnak stretched and smiled. Right now, there was only one more bastard to take care of. Hearing this, Bishop Straff took a deep breath and did not move a muscle. Realizing that he was no match against these people, he raised his arms and surrendered. He promised to tell them every piece of information he had, but this fool must have misunderstood what was going to happen next. It would be simpler to just kill him and make his soul descend for interrogation. There was no need to complicate things further than that. Before handing out the kill shot, Karnak asked Sarathi if the bishop should be killed. and she had no qualms about letting this maniac rot in hell. Baron Karnak's sharp and visceral mana took the form of a scythe, a fitting weapon for a fitting end. Bishop Straff panicky tried to run away, but it was way too late for that. He got his body eviscerated by the giant scythe, painting the ground with his dirty blood. With every enemy taken care of, it was time for necromancy business. Karnak sat beside the bishop's corpse and began. After a few moments, he managed to draw a spherical concoction of dark energy from Straff's corpse. Karnak was pleased with the amount of necromancy mana he got. It was roughly the same as 30 servings of mediocre necromancers. With this, they had gathered enough to warrant a return home. The King of Death and his head commander were already planning which restaurants to try on the way back. If Sarathi had not reminded them of their abducted comrades, they would have totally left without paying them any mind. After untying the two and waking them up, the trio gave them a cover story of how they defeated Bishop Straff with just 3 people. Karnak insisted that they were lucky, as their attack coincided with the sudden rise of an army of zombies that attacked the residents. He asserted that other necromancers used the commotion to rise in revolt. Thanks to Straff's rough personality, this story was not too hard to believe. After that, they got Sarathi's help and chased after the bishop, leading to the basement. Alias attributed this win to Hatoba's blessing and thanked the trio for the save. Karnak also let the priest proceed with the purification ritual, insisting that they did not meddle with the corpse. Using his staff, Alias invoked his divine magic to purify the bishop's lifeless body. He managed to achieve a concentration of at least 10 times the amount of darkness at the end compared to other necromancers. Karnak did not empty every bit of necromancy power inside Straff, including all the info. It would have been too suspicious if they had taken everything. With Straff defeated, Ranfelt had not lost their primary force, and the city was bound to stabilize soon. The rest of the work could be entrusted to the Order. On the way out, Alias also received the shocking news that Miss Sarathi had become a knight of the Gestured Barony. Perplexed, the priest asked why such a promising talent pledged to a relatively unknown house. She explained that the events from last night made her realize that Baron Karnak was someone worth pledging her allegiance to. She looked like she did not mean her words, though. Alias was just glad that she found someone to serve. For now, Karnak and his gang needed to return to his territory to officially ordain his new knight. So this was goodbye for now. Karnak hoped that when the opportunity arose, the group would be reunited once more. The journey back to Gestured Estate was long and uneventful, so we're skipping it. As soon as they arrived in front of the manor, Old Man Tapel and the entirety of the staff welcomed them with smiles. It was nice to see familiar faces again. Just as Tapel was about to ask them about the journey, his words started trailing off. He looked behind the young lord and saw a beautiful red-haired woman. Tapel could not contain the excitement in his heart. This woman must have accompanied the young lord through his journey. Maybe Karnak had decided to take the next step in his adult life. But the waitstaff's enthusiasm was dashed after hearing that Sarathi Allen was just the new knight of the Gestured Barony. Skeptical of her addition to their territory's knight order, Tapel politely reminded Karnak that they couldn't just ordain anyone to be a proper knight. Barrow signaled the young woman to show them what she had. To see is to believe, after all. Drawing her sword, she showed them the crimson-red battle aura, wrapping and dancing around her blade. She used the raging energy wrapped around the sword to launch an attack that made a mess of the landscaping. It eventually reached a tree and sliced it in half. Her sheer destructive power was something that ordinary people do not see every day. Sheathing her sword, Sarathi properly greeted the staff of the manor, while they all wondered what such a talented fighter was doing in their shabby area. Things had been relatively peaceful in the barony for a few weeks after they had arrived. Sarathi had adjusted to her new life, constantly training and sparring with the barony's military force. She had gained quite a reputation for making the soldiers struggle. Almost everyone had experienced being beaten by the fiery redhead. Sarathi had mopped the floor with men bigger than her with just strength and technique. She was not even using her battle aura when sparring. Today was no different. The soldier could not handle the smoke and got his blade knocked loose from his grasp. Another win for the new knight. The captain had to step in and end the training for the day. While the soldiers headed out of the training grounds to clock out and relax, Barros walked toward Sarathi to thank her for helping the other knights train. With a sword already in his hand, Barros asked if he could spar with her next. She answered by immediately wrapping her blade with battle aura and launching a serious attack. Barros easily deflected the fierce offense while criticizing her for her awkward use of aura. Immediately countering, he knocked her out of balance while adding that Sarathi had a tendency to waste her power instead of just using the right amount of strength in each strike. But working on those glaring issues was easier said than done. Sarathi knew that all too well. Retreating to widen the gap between them for a second, Sarathi asked a question. She asked if he could just enter her body again, as Sarathi believed that she could try to get a feel for it if she could experience him inside her a few more times. Barrow scratched his head and advised against that idea, as possessing someone more than thrice could corrupt the body's soul, leading to insanity. But he assured her that she could easily get stronger without the crutch of possession. She had the talent to go far. Also, he was going to need her help awakening his own battle aura soon. Meanwhile, Karnak was still mulling over the oddity of the bishop's techniques. He still could not figure out just how Straff managed to combine necromancy and divinity. That opened up the possibility of combining different powers together. But Karnak had never encountered something like this in the first timeline. Or he would have learned of it already. For the first time in a long time, he was stumped by a problem pertaining to necromancy. For now, it was more important to block the hole that was spreading darkness. From his understanding, the darkness of the end flowed and pierced through time and space to enter the land. For that, he needed to make a powerful physique to investigate the dangerous plane of time and space. Using his necromancy power washed down into several strands, he manipulated them into form without a single bit of error. It resulted in a dark eye made of his own necromancy power taking form. This eye had a physique powerful enough to endure through a time-space investigation. He called it the Eye of Darkness. The creation of the eye led the gang to yet another journey. Out in the forest of Deventor territory, Karnak reprimanded Barros for not awakening his battle aura when he used to be the world's greatest martial artist. Well, that was before they regressed, and it was a lot easier when the Death King could just give him the dark battle aura. Sarathi was just listening to their ridiculous stories, awkwardly trying to stay out of their business. Earlier in their journey, she learned the truth about how these two idiots caused this whole necromancy renaissance. Learning that your new boss was once a world-dominating Death King was not for the faint of heart. She already had a feeling that these two weren't ordinary people, but nothing could have prepared her for the reveal that they were transcendent beings who once took over the world. If you just look at them and eat like hungry, immature kids, picturing them as apex predators becomes difficult. Right now, their objective was to raise the Eye of Darkness in the Deventor territory to avoid the hassle of getting caught using necromancy on their own turf. Also, Karnak still held a grudge against the Deventors for what they did to his whole family. As the bright moon lit the sky, the time to do what they set out to try had come. Karnak took out the eye, and the sickly and dark energy around it burned the light itself. He was going to send this thing through time and space to see if there was a way to close the door of darkness once and for all. So he sent the eye to the sky, hoping that it would work. It ascended to terrifying heights in a span of a few seconds. They couldn't really open the domain of time and space right now, so they were just peeking through it. Karnak would have to connect with the eye to enter the infinity realm. He would become unconscious, so his two knights would have to protect his body. He closed his eyes and proceeded to establish the connection. From the pitch-black darkness, his sense of sight gradually returned. Karnak successfully gained control of the eye and immediately surveyed the infinity realm. From afar, he saw a silhouette of a tree in the middle of an endless body of water. He hopped a little closer and was in awe of the plant and its crimson body. He finally found what he was looking for. The Tree of Emptiness, Astra Schnaf. This was the true form of authority he used to wield. This was essentially a piece of him, but he wouldn't deny that it looked ugly as hell. From one of its branches, a red fruit fell and hit the water. The water rippled and sent the fruit someplace else. This explained how the darkness of the end kept spreading through all corners of the world. Stopping Astra Schnaf from dropping fruits should stop their problem. All he had to do was find the core of authority. After going around the tree, he quickly found the bundle of dark energy stuck to it. Karnak drew closer, hoping he could glean some more information from it. He was not expecting the authority to speak, calling him a mortal and warning him to stay back. It stated that this place was forbidden to those destined to disappear. The tree introduced itself as death itself, the purveyor of darkness destined to destroy everything. With that, it emanated a powerful shockwave that sent the eye flying. It was the condensed form of the darkness of the end they'd been extracting. The tree was practically controlling Karnak's power with ease. While blowing the eye away, it also mentioned the name Tesronic. With one more wave of darkness, it sent the eye back to the real world, plunging it into a sea of blinding light. The next thing you knew, Karnak was opening his eyes to the worried looks of his knights. He tried to get up, but the headache and nausea were too painful to handle. According to Barros, his body just started floating, and he eventually passed out. Karnak urgently asked his subordinates what god those cultists worshipped. Sarathi recalled that it was the god of death and darkness, Tesronic. There was no doubt about it. He had just met that same god that those lunatics revered. But that should not be possible at all. How could a god exist inside Karnak's supposedly empty husk? In an undisclosed location, 3 mysterious figures gathered to discuss a matter of grave importance. They were the highest-ranking members of the Order of the Black God. The Pope of Death came to inform his peers that there was a problem within the sanctuary. Mr. Dark Lord had a hard time comprehending how that would be possible, as nothing could ever possibly approach their sanctuary. The Priestess of Destruction reacted much calmer. She took it upon herself to confirm this incident. Right after instantly returning to her private study, the priestess rang a servant bell. An attendant hurriedly entered the room, calling her master, Lord Elazar. We may know her as the Priestess of Destruction, but most people know her as Elazar de Replacement, the imperial mage of the Linarcia Empire, and one of 3 archmages in existence. Meanwhile, Karnak and the gang retreated home. Their plan to stop the opening failed. Karnak tried a few more times earlier to no avail, but he could not risk being found. At least they got some decent info out of it. They knew that some sickos were worshipping this Tesranic. The issue was it would be hard to determine their stance. They could either be people taking advantage of the power falling from the tree, or they could be disturbing the tree to obtain power at random. If they were the latter, that meant they had the power to influence forces beyond time and space. They could grow the realm, while Karnak took years to accomplish that feat. So if they really were disturbing the tree, then they had power that went beyond Karnak's as the Death King. That's why they could contain Tesranic in the void. The existence of that bastard god was still a mystery too. Sarathi shyly raised her hand and proposed that part of Karnak's power must have gained consciousness and labeled itself as a god. Barros did not want to entertain the idea, but the Death King could see her idea as a possibility. That would mean he was capable of making gods, and that didn't sit right with his closest bro. At the end of the day, they had too little information to come up with concrete answers. They would have to look into the Order of the Black God first. They would have to investigate some of their higher-level officials to get some useful intel. But as they were right now, finding those secretive officials would be extremely difficult. One way they could get around this information problem would be to enter the King's Order. This prestigious group, the King's Order, was a special imperial organization established for the sole purpose of hunting members of the Order of the Black God. After the Age of Chaos, the 7 Goddess Order, Inquisitors, and Darkness Hunters joined forces to kill Necromancers. Despite their efforts, the cult continued to flourish throughout the continent. They constantly caused chaos and grief. That was because plenty of the cult's members were high nobles or even royalty. Due to this, it had become difficult for the 7 Goddess Order to handle everything on their own. And so, the 7 nations decided to band together and develop a special division, the King's Order. Members of the Order were given the right to be censors. They had the authority to investigate and arrest suspected cultists. They even had permission to execute individuals. Because of their freedom to pass judgment, the selection conditions are the strictest there are. One could only join through referrals. That's another wall our gang can't jump over. They don't know anyone with connections to an imperial organization. Luckily, Sarathi could easily get them the referral they needed right now. Barros and Karnak were so glad to have her and her connections on their side this time. That same night, they packed their bags and went out to God knows where again. Poor old man Tapple just woke up to a handwritten letter from the Baron that he had to leave for a bit, promising to bring fame and honor back to the family. The butler couldn't handle a boss who just goes out of his territory on a whim so frequently. Anyway, the gang reached the city of Dararth by midday. As a lord, Karnak knew that he was not supposed to leave the territory for long periods of time, but he could not help it. There were bigger things at stake here. Suddenly, their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice. Upon seeing the face of their ticket into the King's Order, Barros and Karnak lit up with glee. Karnak led with some small talk and thanked their ticket for coming, even though it was a last-minute request. But their ticket, the dorky priest Alias, was happy to hear from the 3. Last night, as they snuck out of the manor, Karnak found out that Alias had the authority to hand out recommendations, even though the Order and the Church were supposed to be separated. Sarathi explained that a King's Order team always needed a cleric to catch a necromancer. Since the 7 Goddess Order had a monopoly on clerics, they also vetted and recommended skilled fighters to the cause. Alias was a first-rank inquisitor, so his referral should hold some weight. Sarathi heard all of this from the goofy priest himself. He actually called them to the Ranfelt family incident with the plan of recommending them to the King's Order, but they just had to return to Gestured territory in such haste that Alias was not able to bring up the matter. At the end of the day, it all worked out. They almost missed a good opportunity, but they didn't. Alias already had the recommendation written and sealed and was ready to be taken to the headquarters. Although it would not be a guarantee, Alias trusted that all 3 of them would have no trouble getting in. Now that the letter is secured, let's turn our attention to Ustil Kingdom's capital, Drunta. The gang entered the bustling city and immediately went to the King's Order headquarters. Inside, all kinds of fighters were present, veteran knights and powerful mages. Looking around, everyone seemed quite talented and experienced in their own right. Even Karnak admitted that the quality of personnel in this place was better than expected. They'd already seen 2 aura users. The people in the capital were just built different. Suddenly, an attendant came out to invite them into the Order Lord's office after the letter was confirmed. The lord of this impressive operation welcomed them with a smile. This suave-looking middle-aged man introduced himself as the commander of the King's Order, Arentel von Naiad. He was also a Purple Knight. He personally confirmed the letter, deemed them qualified, and the background check came out clean too. Above all, they had a recommendation from Inquisitor Alias, a trustworthy man. But even all of this was not enough to formally enter the King's Order. Karnak was aware that there should be a training period for new members to prevent pagans from infiltrating the Imperial organization. Without wasting any more time, the commander gave them their first training task right away. All three of them were not ready for a mission so soon. But in this line of work, there's always work. Commander Arentel smiled brightly and formally welcomed them as trainees. Back in the lobby of the headquarters, they met with 3 veterans that they would tag along with. The chubby man up front introduced himself as Tarma, the 4th Battalion's general. He would be guiding the 3 Stooges through this mission. He was also the second son of Viscount Alban and a 5th Circle mage. The other 2 were Kald, Delim's dual-blade swordsman, and Alice, a second-rank inquisitor from the Church of the Goddess of Ocean, Artema. Karnak and the gang were just unlucky to join on the day when a mission had just been greenlit. Barros did not expect the general to be a pudgy mage too. Tarma also acknowledged that it must be strange to see a mere 5th Circle mage commanding battle aura users in battle. He elaborated that in this line of work, identity is also an ability. Having a good name is a plus, as they often deal with secular powers. The main jobs of the King's Order don't always involve bloodshed. They mostly collect information, track down pagans, abduct key figures, and conduct interrogations. Just because someone's a good fighter doesn't automatically make them a good fit. Sarathi couldn't help but notice that those missions sounded very villainous. Well, they were villains in the cultists' and pagans' eyes after all. The nature of the job gives mages who can use diverse methods higher value than aura users. That's why most of the generals in the King's Order are talented mages. However, since the organization was built to keep the 7 Goddess Order in check, priests and clerics can't become generals. As for their mission, they had received information that a regional noble had joined the Order of the Black God. The suspect, Count Brelant, was holed up in the south of Ustil Kingdom. The team would have to disguise themselves as adventurers inside Brelant County while gathering proper evidence and possibly handing down the Count's punishment. That was all the info they would be working with. They didn't even have confirmation if the man was a pagan or not. You could see in the veterans' faces that they'd been working on chasing empty leads like this one for far too long. Now Karnak could see why the King's Order was so busy. Out in the county, Count Brelant's castle loomed under a dark and heavy storm. Inside, the Count watched and sat beside his sickly son with worry and distress. A hooded figure urged Count Brelant to open his eyes before his son's sickness got any worse. But the Count stood strong. He knew the fate of those who fell into necromancy. He had heard stories of people being promised a revival only to return as moving corpses. The hooded figure admitted that this was true a while ago, but that practice could not be called true necromancy. Now, they had learned how to serve Tesranic and use the true power of darkness properly. If the Count wanted death not to be his son's fate, the cultists promised to cure the boy's illness. And curing an illness could never be an evil act, right? They continued whispering to the Count, pushing him to the dark side using the fear of losing his young child. The cultists tugged on the Count's heartstrings. They knew just what to say to make him fear more and feel the injustice of the world. Their musings were accompanied by the boy's painful coughs. The Count was hooked. He had already tried commissioning the help of the 7 Goddess Order, and they were of no help. Count Brelant just wanted to give his son a chance to live life. And so, he expressed his desire to learn the ways of Tesranic. At the inn on the outskirts of their territory, a group of disguised King's Order agents had set up their base. This first day was dedicated to information gathering while being careful not to put the target on guard. They would use a method unrelated to pagans with the help of a wanted poster. In the picture was Helon Krat, a notorious wanted criminal in the capital. He was a master of disguise and had never been caught. He sure looked like he was the type to do heinous crimes. But Tarma revealed that Helen Krat was actually a member of the King's Order. They just like using his sketchy face to sell their act as bounty hunters chasing after a payday. The team decided to split into 3 groups and chase leads all around the county. Karnak and Kald were assigned together to conduct some old-fashioned canvassing. Alice and Sarathi also did the same thing. Meanwhile, Tarma and Barros went straight to the Count's castle under the guise of being bounty hunters from the Adventurer Guild. The disguised general played the part perfectly and explicitly asked for the Count's cooperation. Count Brelant looked emaciated and sickly, but he gladly offered his full cooperation to apprehend a dangerous man wandering through his territory. With that, Tarma and Barros stood up and assured the Count that they wouldn't cause any trouble. On the way back, Barros curiously asked the general if that was really all they came for. Tarma replied that it was, and it was also time to return to the inn. Although the conversation did not seem too informative, it gave them enough proof to take action. Although it was subtle, The general had already caught on to the whiff of dark arts. At nightfall, the team reconvened back in the inn to exchange information gathered throughout the day. Kald and Karnak discovered that the Count had lost his wife, leaving only him and his son. The boy had been suffering from an incurable disease that even holy healing spells could not resolve. This was a perfect tragedy for cultists to exploit. The Count also led the charge to expel criminals, causing the crime rate to drop drastically. If it had been handled normally, the criminals would have moved to other towns, but it resulted in a mass disappearance. This was a common occurrence when dealing with necromancers. As for Tarma and Barros, their visit to the castle was quite revealing. He noticed that every window was fitted with thick curtains as if they were installed to block out the sun. A familiar tale that suggests this case pertains to vampires. At the castle of Count Brillant, nights are livelier than the days. In the massive dining hall, father and son sat together to enjoy their meals. While eating his full-course meal, the Count asked his son, who was drinking a bloody red liquid, if he despised his father. The young man simply smiled and stated that this was his first time realizing that life could be so calming. Humans kill to eat and survive. He merely drinks what the order provides, and he doesn't harm anyone. Sure, his diet had changed to drinking blood, but it's still a fate better than early death. Count Brillant kept convincing himself that his son had not changed. He's still the polite and vigilant boy from before, and the Order of the Black God is not heretics. They are merely the new truth of the new age. He also believed that when Tesranic set foot on land to balance life and death, his son would be able to live a normal life again. All he could ask was for his boy to endure a little longer, as he would not let him live in an unnatural body forever. The next day came, and the team continued questioning random people on the streets as they still needed to find irrefutable evidence. While walking around, Alice and Sarathi encountered a man asking if they were the bounty hunters roaming around. The man told them that the Count had found the guy on the wanted poster, which should have been impossible as they were looking for a fake wanted man. This led the group to meet earlier than usual to discuss the Count's invitation to a hideout where they could retrieve a non-existent criminal. It was obviously a trap laid by the Count. He even specified that the criminal would enter the hideout at night. Just as the group was about to dismiss the trap, Karnak worried that this would make things more troublesome. If they ignored the information, the cultists would sense something amiss and would start digging for information about them. The veterans had not even considered that possibility, and they looked at Karnak as though he were a genius when he had merely used common sense. Since this was a trap, the enemy had definitely made the site advantageous for them, but they had no other choice but to play along. The hideout provided by the Count's camp was a little old cabin in the middle of the woods. Inside, the agents sat in silence, waiting for the Count's next move calmly. Sarathi broke the silence by asking how strong vampires are. Tarma answered that they should be just a few times stronger than when they were human. Ancient vampires are a different story, though. Thankfully, they are often discovered quickly and slain just as fast. If an aura user or a mage becomes a vampire, they won't be able to use their old mana and would have to retrain with dark mana, thus becoming weaker. Tarma was doing a good job pacifying the newbies, confidently labeling his group as the kingdom's cream of the crop. Their upbeat discussion was interrupted by a fiery meteor descending on the cabin's roof. Upon landing, it exploded and burned everything in sight. As the debris scattered everywhere, the dust settled, and the whole group was saved by Alice's barrier. She reacted quickly against the sneak attack. In front of them was an army of crimson-eyed warriors. These vampires had already suspected that the king's order had come to their territory to play. No mere bounty hunter could survive their sneak attack, so this pretty much confirmed their hunch. The vampire at the vanguard could actually use a red aura. They identified him as Sir Durald, the strongest knight of Count Brillant. By all accounts, a vampire couldn't possibly use aura. At least this should be enough evidence to enact the authority given to the king's order and declare the Count and his vassals as enemies of the goddess and the king. Tarma commanded them to kneel and receive judgment. The brood of vampires just laughed in his face. This was to be expected. So, the agents calmly drew their weapons and prepared for bloodshed. One side intended to punish the vampires in the name of the king. The other side proclaimed themselves as the bloodthirsty soldiers of Tesranic. The initial clash was a contest of raw strength versus technique. The dual blader, Kald, happened to be quite skilled and powerful enough to dispatch vampires in droves. Unfortunately, deep wounds did not seem to do much against resilient monsters. But this is where their Inquisitor shines. I mean, she literally shines as she invokes the light of the goddess to purify the impure. This spell was powerful enough to burn through a vampire's flesh, causing them to shift their priority to the priestess. A nearby vampire sporting an axe was the first to try. But this was precisely why General Tarma was stationed beside Alice. Using his mana, he raised the earth, disrupting the vampire's charge. From the mound he created, he summoned a stone golem to defend against the enemy's charge. Tarma followed this up with a powerful lightning blast. From the skies, untold volts of electricity shocked the vampire to his core. It took the general quite a bit of effort to neutralize one. The general was informed that Karnak and his gang were just supposed to be a fourth circle mage accompanied by 2 knights, yet they were moving like elite fighters. Barros looked unbothered as each of his blade's flourishes brought down vampires left and right. Karnak's magic missiles were deathly accurate and unimaginably quick. Tarma was just in awe that such skilled people weren't known until now. But this fight is not about whether they win the small skirmishes against the countless slew of vampires. This battle hinges on the fight between the aura users of both sides. Even if Sir Durald and Sarathi are both Red Knights, this would ultimately come down to experience. Their first clash appeared equal, sending each other back a few paces. Their surroundings suffered the backlash of such a fierce collision. Sarathi had a hard time stabilizing herself, but she was not injured. Sir Durald fared a whole lot better. He praised his opponent's pretty face and skills, but he was strange about it. This guy's a bastard. They've only just started, and Sarathi's already exhausted. This does not look too good for the gang. The whole battlefield lit up with aura and mana as each person went toe-to-toe with vampires. Bloodthirsty soldiers fell one by one while psyching themselves up with Tisranic's blessing. They believed that even if they fell, the god of death would grant them resurrection. The main problem with fighting a vampire army was their incredible regeneration capabilities. If the vampire aura user got loose, he could pose quite a bit of a problem. It was up to Sarathi to hold him back and, if not outright, defeat him. She had a larger energy pool than Sir Durald, but could not even find an opening to exploit. Vampires were not supposed to use mana or aura in the first place, yet here they were. Sir Durald attributed this abnormal phenomenon to the blessing granted by the great Tisranic. Sarathi turned to the regression duo and asked if they knew the weaknesses of vampires, as they must have encountered some in their army back then. Well, Barros didn't really know any, and Karnak found vampires to be so weak that he did not bother remembering much about them. She was nearing her limit and in dire need of a break with Barros. But he admitted that he would be outclassed without his own aura. They could always go with Plan P, as her body could still handle 2 more possessions. Just imagining how she would look if her mind fractured was enough for Sarathi to decline that option. Without any other choice, she would have to defeat a stronger foe by herself. What she lacked in finesse, she could make up for with the quantity of latent aura. She swept her blade in one fluid motion, sending an aura slash at the vampire. Sir Durald was forced to block with his own aura blade, but the jump in power caught him off guard. After the aura slash dissipated, Sarathi closed the gap with a leap. She slashed down as hard as she could, but she was a bit too slow to land the hit. Sir Durald was also deluded into thinking he had the power of Tisranic on his side. It was like fighting a man who was being coached by the devil. Sarathi was tough. She took the hits as best as she could and answered back with her own sloppy attacks. Since it had become apparent that the quantity of aura alone would not be enough to defeat the vampire, she needed to reframe her approach. Noticing her confusion and frustration, Barros gave her a little advice. He had already pointed out her flaws before: inconsistent aura usage, wasting energy, and timing her strikes incorrectly. All she had to do was recall the feeling of possession and remember how it felt. She must control her aura and concentrate to the best of her ability. In the middle of the fight, Sarathi closed her eyes and began focusing. Barros reckoned that the experience of high-level combat was still ingrained in her body. If she could unite her mind and purify the energy flowing to her sword better, she should be able to evolve in real time. Suddenly, the chaotic burst of red aura dancing around her blade became more consistent. Sir Durald watched as her entire being became sharper. Refusing to let the enemy get the better of her power-up, Durald charged in with killing intent. Sarathi opened her eyes and asked herself what Barros would do in this situation. Without an ounce of wasted movement, she delivered the crispiest slash she had ever performed. Even she was shocked that the technique worked. Immediately taking advantage of the shifting momentum to her side, Sarathi refined her movement to a higher degree. She could now see how Barros could easily run circles around stronger foes. She realized that targeting the opponent's body or blade was the wrong approach. What she needed to do was pay closer attention and identify the opponent's intentions instead. Sir Durald admitted that the tables had turned, but he was not the type to give up in the middle of a heated battle. Once more, the 2 aura users clashed their blades against one another. Sarathi was beginning to grasp the art of predicting an opponent's movement. It was as if she were channeling the fighting style of Barros without possession. She aimed for the starting point before momentum built up. At that moment, the enemy would be wide open for a swift counter to end the fight. With a wide slash across his stomach, Sir Durald bled out and expelled dark energy. Barros and Karnak watched from the sidelines, relieved that they wouldn't have to intervene, as Sarathi finally grasped the essence of combat. Tarma and his crew were also cleaning up their side of the field with no problems. Meanwhile, Sir Durald gritted his teeth through the injury, while his mind struggled to comprehend the leap in Sarathi's technique in such a short time. Not wanting to disappoint Tisranic, He would gladly drag his enemy into the grave with him if he had to. He knew that it was not looking good for his vampire brothers, and this would be his last stand. So he launched an aura blade, an all-or-nothing attack. Anyone familiar with aura use would see that Durald was overburdening himself and exhausting his aura. He had the luxury to do so because of a vampire's regeneration. The whole veteran crew yelled at Sarathi to move away from the attack, but she stood still and strong. For some reason, she knew that dodging was unnecessary, and she wanted to push herself to the limit. If she messed up and lost a limb, she could just regenerate with her master's help. So Sarathi decided to see who would win in a battle of sheer power. She met the Crimson Aura Blade with her own. The stroke of her blade was sharper than ever before. The clash diced up the ground around the combatants. Debris flew everywhere. It was a good thing that they fought in the middle of nowhere. As the impact dissipated, the crew huddled up and weathered the shockwave. When they opened their eyes, the dust started to thin out. Sir Durald's body remained standing, holding his blade, but his head had already rolled down to the ground, bouncing several times while still conscious. Sarathi was not one to do things halfway, so she leaped and stabbed her sword through the severed head's brain. Afterward, the sun rose, and Alice took care of the crew's injuries with her healing divine magic. Sarathi sustained the heaviest injuries for sure. The veteran crew admitted that they would have been done for if it wasn't for the young woman's show of strength. Thanks to this overnight war, they now have enough evidence to fairly pass judgment on the Count for his sins. And so, they quickly contacted the headquarters for a report. At the castle of Count Brelant, the brilliant agents of the King's Order efficiently dealt with the vampire-infested lair. Alice took the forefront with her divine power. She really delivered justice to the vile creatures of the castle, where even the servants had been turned into vampires. As the crew looked for Count Brelant and his son, the broken old man quietly sat at his desk, clutching a knife in one hand. Right before doing whatever he was about to do, he begged Tisranic to have mercy on his child. With his final words out of the way, the Count painted his desk and windows with his own blood. At the outskirts of the castle, 3 hooded figures were running away as fast as they could. 2 were cultists, and the other was none other than the Count's son. They were forced to retreat before the King's Order raided their home. As they ran, the boy held onto a deep hatred for the King's Order and swore that he would have his revenge someday. He vowed to deliver retribution in the name of the god of death and darkness, Tisranic. In a dense forest, 3 cloaked figures move cautiously when they suddenly spot a trio emerging from the trees. Startled, the Count's son demands their identity. Karnak sternly warns them about leaking necromancy power. Realizing they face the King's Order, one of the Count's son's subordinates urgently tells him to flee, then readies an attack, his fist glowing with green necromantic energy. But Karnak didn't give them a chance to cast any spells. He summoned large hands, likely through necromancy, to restrain them. The 3 reacted with shock and pain as Karnak clenched his fist, ending their lives instantly. Sarathi, standing beside him, questioned who the real villain was in this situation. However, he began absorbing all the darkness of the end from their corpses. She watched in horror, still unable to get used to such things. With a snap of his fingers, he set the corpses on fire. Horrified, she interrupted and reminded him they needed to report finding their target. He calmly replied that he had consumed all the darkness of the end, so there was no point in sparing their bodies, further astonishing her. Barros noted the growing necromancy power and questioned if he could manage it alone with chaos magic. He replied that the situation didn't allow for any hesitation. He explained that both Durald and Straff worried him. Straff still retained his holy powers despite becoming a necromancer, and Durald was able to use aura even though he was a vampire. Barros reassured him, saying they had dealt with their opponents before. However, knowing their enemies hadn't lost their powers was still troubling for him. He explained that energies usually don't mix, requiring one to be given up to learn another. But that rule had been broken. With the darkness of the end, mages could now use magic and necromancy, and aura users could wield both aura and necromancy. Barros noted that Death Knights and Archliches had always used similar methods. He explained that using both original powers and necromancy usually caused severe side effects, such as becoming undead or losing sanity. However, stronger fighters who had previously avoided necromancy might start experimenting, allowing their rival faction to gain strength rapidly. He continued, saying that the 4th Martial King and the 3 Grand Mages could become their enemies. Getting a little more substantial wouldn't be enough. He needed to gather as much power as possible. At the King Order headquarters, Grandmaster Arantel informed them that Tarman had praised their work. He explained that Tarman had given them a strong recommendation, and considering all they had done in their previous mission, they could join the King's Order organization immediately. A bit confused, Karnak agreed to join the organization. Arantel welcomed them to the King's Order. They began celebrating, thinking they would eat well tonight after joining such a prestigious group. However, Their happiness quickly faded when Arantel pointed out that they needed to get to work before any celebration, as a lot piled up. Annoyed by the workload, they began to wonder if joining the organization had been the right choice. So their next days of working passed by hunting down different targets like cultists, which Sarathi often dealt with single-handedly. They also defeated necromancers, who were shocked to see the king's order using necromancy upon them. They spent time faking reports, with Karnak furiously insisting that Barros and Sarathi write correctly. Throughout it all, Karnak would steal some of the darkness of the end from their enemies. This cycle repeated itself over and over until he realized he had gathered a significant amount of necromancy power. He had finally managed to separate the energy of chaos mana and recombine it. A fierce energy clash erupts, and green and red light explodes with a powerful impact from the center. Karnak, focused and determined, is surrounded by a red aura that begins to gather in his hand. He feels a surge of strength as he finally reaches the 6th Circle Mage. At headquarters, whispers about Karnak already reaching the status of a 6th Circle Mage were spreading, leaving many incredulous. One person noted that he had only recently been at the 4th Circle Mage. They assumed it must be his natural talent at work. However, Karnak was concerned that others might think he was a necromancer. He explained that while studying in the countryside under a single code, his circles didn't advance. But now, with the king's order's resources, he had become a 6th Circle Mage. Sarathi reassured him not to worry. Since people didn't understand how the darkness of the end worked, no one would suspect him of necromancy. In the Grandmaster's office, Arantel was also pleased to have him as a Grand Mage in the organization. He felt relieved, knowing that even Arantel did not suspect him of being a necromancer. Arantel then informed him that the captain's position in the 7th Division was vacant and wanted him to fill it. After carefully considering his contributions, the organization believed he was more than worthy. With high expectations, Karnak was told he must work hard. Reflecting on the promotion, he understood it simply meant more work. However, a week later, at the southeast border fortress Arthra of the Eustal Kingdom, loud cries echoed constantly from the basement of the central tower. Melia, a second-rank inquisitor, was horrified by the sounds. She prayed to her god, asking the sinful soul to surrender and repent. Though she knew inquisitors must torture cultists when necessary, she was grateful to remain outside while Captain Karnak handled the task, as she couldn't bear to watch. Inside the room, the cultist was frantically begging for the torture to stop, claiming he was ready to reveal everything. But Barros continued, driven solely by his desire to hear the man scream. Karnak was surprised by the cultist's resilience to the pain. While beside him, Sarathi urged him to stop pretending since Melia would believe they were still questioning him. Despite the cultist's desperate pleas, he couldn't endure the torment any longer. It was Karnak's turn to summon the soul for the true information. The spirit revealed about Tesronic, being the destructive god of darkness and death and the god of Genesis, who would bring a new order into the world. This belief was held by every cultist they captured, frustrating Karnak because none of them truly knew what was going on. Sarathi noted that their order was ruled by 3 leaders, 6 cardinals, and 13 archbishops. Bishops and priests came last after archbishops, with bishops running small organizations. So far, they had only captured ordinary priests with no useful information. Barros added that they needed to capture at least a bishop, to which Karnak hoped they could target someone more influential, and wondered why a major incident hadn't happened yet. Back in the Grandmaster's office, Arantel was focused on a report stating that there was a rumor that someone was collaborating with the cult in Drunta, the capital. Karnak asked who the suspect might be. He revealed that the suspect was none other than the 2nd Prince of the Eustile Kingdom, His Highness Alfred Ludan Eustil. The news stunned everyone that the prince could be involved in such treachery. As the story progresses, we learn about the turmoil within the Eustile Kingdom. King Westcotty has 2 sons and a fierce rivalry over who will inherit the throne. The first prince, Lord Ludan Eustil, and the second prince, Alfred Ludan Eustil, both have strong claims to the crown. While it would seem logical for the first prince Lloyd to be the heir, his background is far from simple. Years ago, Melia from the Count Feeler family was brought into the royal family through an arranged marriage and became the true queen. However, their inability to produce an heir over the decades created a looming crisis for the kingdom's future. Desperate for a successor, the king was forced to accept Kelpia from the Marquitalian family into the royal fold. Just 3 months after Kelpia's arrival, news broke that she was pregnant. The child she bore was Lloyd, the first prince. Overjoyed, the king proclaimed Prince Lloyd his successor, blessing his decision in the name of the goddess Allium. But shortly after this, Queen Melia finally bore a child as well, Alfred, the second prince. This threw the royal household into chaos, torn between the eldest first prince and the direct bloodline second prince. With both sons vying for importance, the question of who should succeed the king became a complex dilemma. King Westcott I, unable to make a decisive choice, declared he would only decide once both princes reached adulthood, putting the matter to rest for the time being. In the streets of Drunta's capital, Karnak and Barros discuss how King Westcott I's indecision led to multiple uprisings. He suspects the king delayed choosing an heir to ensure the other would inherit if something happened to one of the princes. Karnak continued, explaining that the two families serving the princes for over 20 years have never stopped their internal battles. Barros dismisses it as a mess, but Sarathi suggests that if there aren't enough reasons, wouldn't it be easiest to choose the next king based on their abilities or personality? Karnak agrees, noting that if they do, Prince Lloyd, who is calm and composed, seems more suited for the throne, while Prince Alfred is violent and arrogant. However, since both are still young, they haven't had the chance to fully demonstrate their abilities. She then asks why the king hasn't selected Prince Lloyd if he's so well suited. Karnak explains that it's because Prince Lloyd is physically weak. Despite years of sword training, he's never been healthy enough to master his skills. On the other hand, Prince Alfred is strong and naturally talented in martial arts. Now, understanding the situation's complexity, Sarathi realizes why choosing the next king is difficult. Barros then asks who reported that Prince Alfred was colluding with the Dark Order. He reveals that it was a spy planted by Prince Lloyd, who stumbled upon the information by chance. Concerned, the prince sent an informal report to the king's order, and Commander Arentel, who was once the vice commander of the Imperial Knights, recognized the first prince's handwriting. He wraps up, saying that's all they know for now, but a messenger will provide more details later. As they stand outside an old cafe, Barros mentions that this is where they're supposed to meet Prince Lloyd's spy. Inside, the cafe is covered in cobwebs. They spot a nervous-looking man, and Karnak approaches him. The man, in a shaky voice, asks what they want. Although he's putting on a tough act, Karnak questions if he's the one who received orders from Lord Lloyd, to which the man confirms, realizing they were sent by Sir Arentel. Barros demands he reveal his identity, and with no way out, the man discloses who he is. To their shock, it turns out he's Prince Alfred. The trio is stunned, wondering how he could have reported on himself. Seeing their confusion, the prince clarifies that he is aware that he looks like Prince Alfred, but he reveals he is not Alfred. Just then, Lloyd Eustyle, the rightful heir to the throne, speaks through Alfred's vessel. As the story progressed, it became clear that the souls of Lloyd and Alfred had indeed been swapped. Karnak, initially doubtful, took a closer look and realized the truth. The body's shape didn't match the soul inside it, and the soul seemed disrupted. Alfred, standing nearby, admitted he expected this to be hard to believe. However, Karnak quickly pointed out that necromancy contains plenty of spells that could cause such a swap. Lloyd felt relieved, knowing he had made the right choice in contacting the king's order. If anyone could recognize that he was under a necromancy spell, it would be them. Noticing how quickly Karnak understood the situation, he asked if ordinary mages could detect such a swap. Karnak admitted that it would be impossible for most mages to figure it out. Then, Lloyd pressed him for further explanation. He explained that it would be strange for anyone to act out of character without raising suspicion, and the King's Order members were exceptionally skilled in identifying necromancy. They had the knowledge and experience to see through such complex magical interference, just as they were doing now. Lloyd, with a heavy sigh, couldn't hide the frustration building inside him. He asked if there was any way magic could prove he was under a necromancy spell. Karnak, trying to make sense of it all, asked him to go over the events of the day his soul swapped. He explained that 5 days ago, he had been going through his usual treatment of holy healing magic before bed. Just as everything was going as planned, Barros interrupted, surprised to discover Lloyd needed daily healing magic. That's when Lloyd realized the rumors about his frail body had spread further than he'd thought. Barros confirmed this by joking that even zombies might be in better shape than him. Still, Lloyd went to bed without any problems, feeling safe under the estate's holy barrier. But the following day, he woke up in his brother's body. Confused, he wondered if necromancy was powerful enough to swap souls so easily. Karnak found the situation strange. Whoever had cast such a spell must have been strong enough to break through the holy barrier protecting the estate. If that were the case, they would have needed to plant something inside the estate. But as Lloyd mentioned, nothing seemed unusual. Lloyd continued, explaining how he woke up tied to a chair in a strange place. When he regained consciousness, he was surprised to feel healthy. No pain, no fever, and his joint aches were gone. Alarmed, he started to wonder if he had been kidnapped. 3 men entered the room, addressing him as Prince. Panicking, Lloyd demanded to know what they had done to him. They handed him a mirror, and to his shock, the reflection staring back at him wasn't his own. It was his brother Alfred's body. The men laughed, telling him that he and Prince Alfred had swapped bodies, all thanks to the power of Lord Tesranic. The Tesranic name made Lloyd realize that these people were part of a cult. Demanding answers, he asked why they had swapped their bodies. Among the men was Sir Sebastian, one of Alfred's trusted followers. He accused Sebastian of betraying Alfred by putting him in Lloyd's frail body. Sebastian chuckled, saying that's one way to look at it. Lloyd, confused by his calm attitude, began to wonder if Alfred had orchestrated this whole thing. With a smirk, Sebastian untied him and told him that they wanted nothing from him, simply that he stayed in place like an obedient child. They locked the doors and windows with steel bars, trapping him inside. Despite the strange situation, he found himself not hating his captivity. His body was no longer sick, and the food they gave him was excellent. For the first time in a long while, he didn't suffer from stomach problems. He couldn't help but enjoy the simple pleasure of eating without pain, something Barros and Karnak could easily relate to. However, Sarathi, curious about his escape, asked how he managed to break free. He, shaking his head, said that even if he explained it, they probably wouldn't believe him. After inhabiting Alfred's body, Lloyd realized it was his first proper breakfast, and wondered what his opponents were planning by treating him so well. He couldn't plan to escape because too many guards were watching him closely. They seemed to be taking good care of Alfred's body. However, he knew he might have a chance to flee if he could use this body as leverage. Feeling the vital life force coursing through Alfred's body, he decided to trust its strength and find a way out. 4 elite knights, fully armed, served him a meal. One noted Sir Sebastian's concern about Lloyd's unpredictability, while another remarked that Prince Lloyd wouldn't know how to handle a sword. They heard Lloyd's voice telling them to enter when they knocked on the door. However, as they stepped inside, they couldn't see him. Hiding in the shadows, Lloyd swiftly struck out, landing a decisive blow on one of the knights before he could react, leaving him momentarily stunned and off balance. He quickly drew his sword and took up an attacking stance. The knights were shocked to see how accurately Lloyd, now in Alfred's body, could hit a knight's weak spot. With a calm yet mocking demeanor, he looked at the knights. They must be surprised, he noted. Had they ever learned swordsmanship while stuck in a dying body? As his opponent stammered, he explained that one must rely on strategy and technique, using minimal movement. He then asked what they thought would happen now that he was in a healthy body. Without waiting for an answer, Lloyd lunged forward, showing them his true strength. The enemy, caught off guard, barely had time to react before being struck with a powerful blow. The impact force sent the knight flying through the air, crashing violently to the ground. Blood splattered onto the floor in the aftermath of the attack. A maid who witnessed the scene stood in shock, her hands covering her mouth, horrified by the violent display. He reassured the maid not to worry, promising he wouldn't harm her, and quickly left the room. As he carefully made his way out, he couldn't help but feel disappointed in himself. Alfred had the advantage of a more muscular body, which only highlighted Lloyd's frustration with his own. Suddenly, 2 guards approached him and Lloyd tensed up, reaching for his sword. However, he realized the guards were addressing him as Prince Alfred, which meant they might know about the soul swap. Thinking quickly, he fled over the walls, pretending to leave for a stroll. Deciding he needed help, he hid in the slums, planning to seek the king's support. When Karnak heard his story, he suggested capturing the cultists responsible for the soul swap. The problem was that cultists were hard to track down once they went into hiding, and they had likely already fled the manor where Lloyd had been held. They began to plan their next move, knowing Alfred would be preparing something against them. Karnak mentioned that they needed to lure the necromancers to them. Lloyd sighed, realizing that meant he'd have to act as bait. But Karnak pointed out that just Lloyd wouldn't be enough. The knights could easily capture him, so they decided to create bait that no necromancer could refuse. A few days later, outside Drunta, at the hideout of Alfred's supporters, Sir Sebastian was worried. If Lloyd had contacted his own supporters, it could become a significant problem. Bishop Detzras, a 5th Circle mage, reassured him that this wouldn't happen, as the spies they had planted in the palace had reported nothing so far. His direct subordinates, Cayley Borson and Olt Gelfarent, added that if Prince Lloyd was plotting something, they would have known by now. They had already prepared to counter any moves he might make, and all they needed was to bring his body back at the right time. The bishop mentioned that the soul change ring, the necromancy spell, was still active, so there shouldn't be any issues. But he cautioned that they still needed to stay alert. He then asked if there was any way to use necromancy to track down Prince Alfred's body, but since they were the ones who cast the spell, they could not figure it out. Their only option was to continue searching for Lloyd on foot. Suddenly, a soldier rushed in to inform Sir Sebastian that they had spotted Prince Alfred's body to the south near Delane Street. Realizing this was where Lloyd's supporters might be, he immediately ordered Alfred's personal squadron, the Crimson Flame Squad, to go after Lloyd. He felt relieved, thinking he would soon have Prince Alfred's body back under control. Late at night on Delane Street, Lloyd creeps past a few men while Karnak and Barros stealthily watch from the rooftops of the nearby buildings. Suspecting that Lloyd might be Prince Alfred, the guards start to follow him. Noticing their movement, Lloyd turns around and asks why they're tailing him. They respond that they're here to escort him back to the palace. He faces them and asks if he really looks like Alfred. Seeing Alfred's face, they assume he's not in his right mind, as previously informed. They tell him they've been ordered to take him somewhere, even if it means forcing him. One guard steps forward to grab him. Out of nowhere, Sarathi leaps between them and dares the guards to try to take the prince away from her. In that moment, a powerful necromancy spell is unleashed, filling the area with a dark, swirling energy that radiates a chilling, ominous aura. The guards of the Crimson Flame Squadron are caught within its reach, and the foreboding energy sends a wave of fear through them. They panic, believing Sarathi to be an evil spirit, just as Karnak had planned. The dark energy surrounds and distorts the entire area, creating a sense of chaos and dread among those trapped within its grasp. The Crimson Flame Squadron is thrown into chaos as they react to the sudden burst of necromancy, with dark, swirling purple energy enveloping them. They panic, shouting that a necromancer has taken control of their prince, and they voice their fear and uncertainty about how to handle the situation. Their terror escalates as the menacing aura closes in, and some flee in fear. A portal suddenly opens, and giant octopus-like limbs shoot out, grabbing the guards who try to run away. More portals appear, snatching the rest of the guards and killing them instantly, except for one man who manages to escape. Witnessing the brutal display of necromancy, Lloyd considers it to be horrifying dark magic. In a flashback 2 days earlier, in the slums of Runta at Karnak's hideout, he and his team discuss their plan to bait necromancers. He explains to Lloyd that necromancers are usually terrified of being exposed and rarely reveal themselves unless they need to fight a strong enemy. That's why they intend to create an enemy under similar conditions. Lloyd is shocked to hear they plan to use a necromancer as bait. He further explains that their enemies will think they won't call the king's order on them because they plan to collaborate with a necromancer too. He adds that necromancers can steal each other's powers to grow stronger, so they'll definitely appear. Lloyd is confused about the risks of working with a necromancer, but Karnak reassures him it will appear as if Lloyd cast the spell himself using confiscated items and trick magic. Karnak, however, is lying, knowing Lloyd knows nothing about magic. Lloyd then rationalizes that this is how the king's order would justify such tactics, so he agrees to the plan. Sarathi, on the other hand, worries about who will play the necromancer, hoping it's not her. But as it turns out, she is the one chosen to act as the necromancer. In the present, Barros and Karnak descend from the building and check on Lloyd, asking if he's injured. Lloyd thanks Sarathi, saying he's fine because of her. Noticing the spell, he tells Karnak it looks like necromancy, even though he knows it's just a trick. However, Sarathi knows the truth. It was real necromancy. Lloyd then mentions that he saw one guy escape, to which Karnak responds that it was intentional. The man will report back to his superiors, and soon, the necromancers will take the bait. Back at Alfred's supporters' hideout, a soldier informed Sebastian that one of the Crimson Flame Squad members who escaped had witnessed a necromancer among the enemy forces. Sebastian was left speechless, knowing Prince Lloyd had also been cooperating with necromancers. Determined to retaliate, he chose a tit-for-tat approach. Detzras and his 2 subordinate necromancers assured him that dealing with such threats was their specialty, urging him to leave the task to them. Sebastian, trusting their skills, assigned them the mission. They readily accepted, promising to bring Prince Lloyd back. Detzras, wearing a menacing smile, believed that since the enemies had taken down the Crimson Flame Squad, they were no ordinary necromancers. He planned to seize every drop of their power. In Delane Street, he devised a plan. If the enemies were necromancers too, they would likely be seeking power. His subordinates would act as bait, drawing out the enemy necromancers while he stayed hidden, ready to ambush. He would share half of the enemy's powers with them if successful. Though hesitant, seeing themselves as bait, the subordinates reluctantly agreed. Now the search was on. Kaylee began casting magic with a blue-spirited lamp, invoking Tesranic. He summoned the cursed souls of warriors, and as the blue aura thickened, numerous warriors emerged from the ground. He commanded them to seek out his master's enemies in the name of darkness. The fully armed soldiers started patrolling the city streets. Meanwhile, Karnak, using his surveillance magic, had already tracked those necromancers. As expected, Sebastian had sent them after his group. The others were also surprised at how quickly they had moved to capture Lloyd at all costs. He told them to gear up because it was showtime. He informed Lloyd that they would handle the mission alone this time, advising him not to accompany them to avoid ambush. They planned to interrogate the necromancers and return with the needed information. The prince thanked him and entrusted the mission to them. However, he was puzzled to see Barros and Sarathi carrying a pan and a mob. With a confident tone, he assured him that while it might look ridiculous, this was the optimal anti-cultist armament. The cursed warriors roamed the city relentlessly, sparing neither homes nor restaurants, terrifying the residents as they searched for their master's enemies. The city was under their control, but Sarathi and Barros watched them closely from the shadows. She expressed concern, saying they should at least leave the townspeople alone. However, Barros casually remarked that the warriors were being kind since they weren't harming anyone. He angered her by adding that harming people would only provide more bodies for their cause. Furious, she retorted that the mindset of all necromancers was inhumane. As they argued, a cursed warrior suddenly appeared behind Barros. Kylie, the master of the warriors, instantly sensed the loss of one of his minions. Looking down the street, he saw Sarathi and Barros battling his forces, so he commanded all his summoned warriors to attack them immediately. The undead soldiers charged toward the pair, but as they fought off the minions, Kale and Olt were surprised to find their enemy defending with a mop and a pan. They wondered if this was some strange form of necromancy they were unaware of. Watching both necromancers, they swiftly implemented their plan, wielding their makeshift weapons with surprising skill. The two necromancers, watching from afar, noticed that the pair wasn't using magic but were smashing the minions away. Frustrated, Kaylee cast another spell, summoning a necromantic field, a stinking swamp of the dead. Suddenly the ground before them transformed into a pool of thick blood, with undead arms rising. Barros was momentarily taken aback by the necromancer's power, realizing they were skilled opponents. As an undead arm lunged at him, he skillfully dodged, showing his agility. Kale grew increasingly irritated as he watched the girl furiously strike down the arms, realizing his spell failed to trouble them. Now, Barros and Sarathi decided it was time to strike. The two necromancers could see them planning. Suddenly both hurled their weapons at them, then drew their swords and drove them into the ground. The necromantic field of blood was quickly overwhelmed by a green aura, sweeping away the bloody terrain with their own necromantic energy. Magically, their thrown weapons returned to them. Barros warned the necromancers that they couldn't hope to stand against them with such trivial tricks. The two necromancers were left shocked and troubled, unable to understand what spells their enemies were using. But then, Olt stepped forward. Tapping into his hellish powers, he transformed into a demonic beast with protruding horns. With the power of chaos coursing through him, his muscles swelled, tearing through his shirt, and a strange dark aura began to emanate from him. Without hesitation, he charged at them. Barros and Sarathi quickly split up, and Barros left the demon to her, and the battle began. The demon unleashed a flurry of strikes, but she skillfully deflected them with her sword. The enraged monster realized that while she had grown stronger, she was no match for his demonic form. He pounced at her again, but she quickly countered each of his powerful attacks. She taunted him, saying that turning into such a grotesque shape wasn't impressive. This only fueled his anger further. He tried a different approach, spitting magical energy at her, but she quickly spun her pan and blocked the magic attack. Now, the demon was panting with frustration. Kale noticed that their attacks were effortlessly blocked every time their enemies swung their weapons, but he couldn't figure out what kind of magic they were using. Little did they know, it was all Karnak's necromancy from the start. He controlled the battlefield from a distance, knowing the necromancers would be clueless about his presence. They kept guessing about the magical spells their enemies were supposedly using, but in reality, there were none. Throughout the battle, Karnak used the frying pan and mop as mere distractions to conceal the true power of darkness. He knew that even if the necromancers believed in the ruse, they would eventually discover the truth. And his hunch was correct. Kale started to sense something was off. If their enemy necromancers were right in front of them, then why was the death energy coming from somewhere else? It seemed to be emanating from above the buildings. He quickly realized it was a misdirection, and that their enemies had been toying with them all along. Kale ordered Olt to stop wasting time on the fools carrying pans and a mop. He recognized they were merely distractions for someone else. He pointed out Karnak on the rooftop, declaring him the real necromancer. Sarathi and Barros realized their plan had been discovered and finished things quickly. They rushed toward the old demonic monster, attacking him first. However, the monster changed tactics, spitting powerful energy not at them, but at Karnak, breaking the magical shield that had been protecting him. They chanted in triumph, believing they had broken the spell, but they were mistaken. Karnak was completely unharmed. He mocked them, pointing out that they had foolishly ignored Barros and Sarathi, whose ordinary weapons could still cause significant damage. As a result, Barros and Sarathi struck hard, forcing the two necromancers to surrender. Karnak then captured them with his dense, dark magic. Barros slapped them to bring them back to consciousness. With swollen faces, The two necromancers could only wait in frustration for their bishop. But when they saw Karnak's immense aura of power, they realized he was far more potent than any enemy they had ever faced. He was a true necromancer. Karnak told them to have a nice chat with him, but both necromancers knew they couldn't handle him and couldn't allow themselves to be a burden to the order. So they invoked Lord Tesranic, took refuge in his power, and killed themselves by crushing their own hearts. The trio watched in disbelief, thinking the necromancers were insane. As Karnak summoned their souls, he wondered if they were real necromancers. Nonetheless, he seized their souls and captured them. The souls wailed in despair, realizing their suicide had been pointless. Karnak decided they should take the souls to a calmer place to extract information. As for the bodies, which still held some necromantic power, they decided to keep them for future use. But one thing nagged at Karnak. Prince Lloyd had reported 3 necromancer followers, which meant there was still one more hiding somewhere. They decided they could use these 2 as bait. Sarathi wondered aloud why the last necromancer hadn't made a move yet, and Karnak was curious too. Meanwhile, Bishop Detzrus, lurking nearby, could not step in. Sweating in fear, he cursed himself for his subordinates falling for such a simple trick. They must have let their guard down. Unsure of what to do next, he realized he couldn't gauge Karnak's abilities, but he couldn't allow his enemies to slip away. Determined, he decided to follow them, intent on finding a way to strip all 3 of their powers. In a hidden hall in the slums, Karnak questioned the souls of the 2 necromancers, demanding to know everything they did. They quickly informed him that they were operating under the orders of Bishop Detzrus, who was following the commands of Cardinal Hudal Grenthal, the one in charge of the Ustil Kingdom. An individual instructed the necromancers to work alongside Bishop Detzrus in upcoming events. He asked about the Bishop Detzrus, and they revealed that he was a necromancer and a 5th Circle mage, receiving orders from above as they pursued their mission. Thinking about Detzrus being both a mage and a necromancer, he suspected he was the one currently hiding. However, he pushed that thought aside and asked what they had done to pierce the holy barrier and swap the bodies of the 2 princes. To his surprise, they explained that they didn't need to breach the holy barrier because the curse wasn't meant for Prince Lloyd, but for Prince Alfred. This revelation shocked Karnak, implying that Prince Alfred had cursed himself as part of his plan. The necromancers explained that they used a curse to swap bodies within a bloodline, and could quickly proceed with their plan as long as they had Prince Alfred, even without access to Lloyd. He then questioned whether the curse required the target's agreement to succeed. They explained that they used a magic mirror to make it appear like Prince Lloyd was participating in the curse. He realized that they had used necromancy to fix issues with the spell, enabling them to perform an otherwise impossible curse. But still, he wondered why Prince Alfred switched bodies with Prince Lloyd. He asked if there was anything to gain from Lloyd's weak body. The necromancers were about to respond when, suddenly, Bishop Detzrus used his magic to destroy their souls, cutting the conversation short. He then declared that it would be better for Karnak to surrender. In an instant, Karnak moved behind him and asked who he was. Detzrus, impressed by his speed, admired his skill. Karnak replied, noting his good intuition, and guessed that he must be the bishop himself. Detzrus, realizing the gravity of the situation, knew he needed to focus. He cast a spell at the center of a swirling energy vortex. He called out for the shadows of the bitter cold to come forth and open the night of Acheron. The group stared at the looming ice, sensing the same eerie power surrounding them. Suddenly, powerful ice monsters, crackling with intense, swirling energy, appeared before them. The space around them felt different, as if it had shifted somehow. Sarathi thought it was similar to when they fought Straff. Barros added that their situation hadn't changed much since then. There wasn't much they could do. He noted that it seemed like their enemy had combined both mana and necromancy. She worried that they might be in serious trouble if it was like last time. But Karnak dismissed her concern, saying it hadn't been a big issue. All they needed to do was erect a barrier, just like they did with Straff. Karnak then cast a barrier, swirling with dark energy, creating a sharp contrast against the cold blue environment filled with icy monsters. Detzrus felt taken aback as he was surrounded by the same swirling dark energy, shocked by what he saw. Karnak's barrier activated, its dark energy overpowering the cold blue surroundings. The icy monsters melted away instantly in the presence of Karnak's power. Detzrus was stunned to see his necromantic barrier crumble so quickly. Feeling vulnerable, he asked him if he could dispel his curse. However, Detzrus still had more to do. Drawing on the power granted by Lord Tesranic, he invoked dark forces, summoning wandering spirits to his side. The ground cracked and shattered under the force of his command. In an instant, a swarm of glowing spirits surrounded him. The group stood their ground, their eyes locked on the dark figure before them. Barros noticed that Detsras relied heavily on numbers to gain the upper hand. He asked Karnak if they should retreat like last time, but Karnak dismissed the idea. This time they only needed to defeat Detsras. He extended his hand quickly, unleashing scorching magic bullets. The searing blast caught the undead, dissolving their dark essence in a flash of radiant energy. As the last spirits faded, Karnak smirked and said they were not the same as before.